Chapter 125. The opponent's 3 legions were distributed in an inverted triangle. In theory, the weak points were the 2 flanks. Pharaoh could not count on the Nra legion to break through the army of Nanner in the southern border of the Hittite kingdom. As long as they could form a strategic restraint, Amon would have completed his task. Then the Enlil legion led by King Lucier would be the most suitable target. There were 2 main reasons why Pharaoh decided to raid the Enlil legion. First, the main purpose of this expedition was to establish a strategic stronghold along the inland lake, where there were water sources and pastures. If the Hittite kingdom was one step ahead, it would be very passive in the future. It was necessary to remove this nail before the Enlil legion could gain a firm foothold. Second, the king of the opponent was also there. As the saying goes, to capture the followers, one must first capture the king. If the Enlil legion could be broken up, it would severely damage the morale of the entire Hittite kingdom. There might even be no need to fight the next battle. Third, was also very important, because of the water source. According to the distribution of the 3 legions of the Hittite kingdom, the places with water sources were blocked behind the front line. There was no water in the desert. The fresh water needed must be transported hundreds of miles from the south to the front line. If the front line of defense could not be breached in a short time, the transportation of fresh water alone would become a heavy logistical burden for the Igut army. Attacking the inland lake, and taking the lead in seizing the places with water sources to build camps for the army. The grassland beside the lake could also be grazed, which would greatly reverse the logistical disadvantage. Now that the Enlil legion was establishing a permanent stronghold, taking this opportunity to launch a surprise attack was the best strategic choice. Lazathai's analysis made even himself admire his wisdom, and his subordinates could not refute it. To be on the safe side, the Horus Legion also sent a group of mages to investigate the enemy by flying artifacts. Even the chief priest, the 9th-level supreme mage Ricard, was personally dispatched. After all, it was to explore the way for Pharaoh. If there was reconnaissance, there would be counter-reconnaissance. In the sky above the northern end of the desert, there were several unknown battles between mages. Several mages died with their flying artifacts, but some managed to return. High Priest Ricard flew high up in the sky to observe the enemy's camp. He successfully shook off the other party's pursuit, and found out the arrangement of the Hittite kingdom's battle formation. It was exactly the same as the spy's confession. At that time, the Horus Legion was 700 miles away from the Enlil Legion, with the Saya Desert between them. Pharaoh immediately gave the order to attack at full speed. Behind them, there was still the half of the Legion of Set responsible for logistics and supplies, and the entire elite legion of Isis. With the power of 2.5 elite legions, Lazath II was already waiting for victory to beckon to him. Amon received 3 consecutive intelligence reports during the march. The first one was from Roddik, asking him to cooperate with the Pharaoh army to speed up its advance. The second one was an official order from Pharaoh's frontline headquarters. The content was very detailed, asking Amon to order the logistics fleet to stay away from the enemy's navy to prevent a sneak attack, and to set up a camp on the shore. At this time, the Nra legion was less than 200 miles away from the enemy's army of Nanner, and was already in a position to launch an attack. However, the frontline headquarters ordered Amon not to take the initiative to attack, but to monitor and contain the enemy. If the enemy launched an attack, they must rely on the camp to firmly defend. If they found that the enemy left the coastline to the east to outflank the Pharaoh army, they must take the opportunity to attack the logistics supply line and contain the main force of the army of Nanner in place. After receiving the order, Amon did not delay. He immediately ordered the supplies to go ashore and set up a camp. A temporary dock was set up on the coast behind the camp, and a group of elite soldiers were sent to escort the ships to ensure that the sea route in the rear would not be interrupted. With the current reserves of food and fresh water, even without the fleet, the Nra Legion would be able to last for more than a month. Amon sent scouts to monitor the movements of the army of Nanner, but found that the enemy did not move. Like him, the enemy had set up a port and camp, and built fortifications along the border. If Amon wanted to attack by force, it was almost impossible for him to win, because he was not only facing a legion, but also the city behind the legion. The war in the desert should have already started. In the area close to the main battlefield, scouts and spies had long lost their space to move. They could only rely on flying mages to communicate. Occasionally, they could use the detection devices operated by supreme mages to investigate the enemy camp, but it was difficult to find out the exact details of the movements in the enemy camp. Amon felt that he was left on the battlefield, and he could only wait for the outcome of the final battle. Although there was no official battle, the atmosphere in the camp was already very solemn. The mages and soldiers were on duty day and night, in the most tense state of alert. About 10 days later, an accident finally happened. At that time, Amon was sitting in the big tent playing chess with Metatro. Suddenly, he frowned and sensed a faintly discernible fluctuation of magic power approaching from afar. He immediately rushed out of the big tent. The Supreme Mage George was also alarmed. He had already flown into the air with his staff in hand. The team of mages set up a magic formation, and the soldiers boarded the semicircular defensive wall formed by chariots with their weapons in hand. The archers were ready to shoot at any time, and the javelins were also holding their spears in a battle formation. A black dot appeared in the eastern sky, and it was rapidly approaching. Amon had good eyesight and could see that it was a flying magic device, the wind shuttle. The two people on the shuttle looked exhausted. The man in front waved his staff again and again. He had already seen Amon's camp, and he gathered the last of his spirit and sped up. The man in the back, covered in blood, drew his bow and knocked an arrow towards the taboo behind. George had already received a message from the man on the shuttle. He shouted, "This is the Supreme Mage Cezanne of the Horus Legion. There are pursuers behind him, let's cover him." Then with a chant, the mages on the ground formed a formation and raised their staffs. Smoke and dust rose from the desert, and the flying sand was rolled into the sky, forming a curtain wall that covered the sky. The curtain wall trembled and buzzed. The wind shuttle passed through the curtain wall without being affected, and was directly let in. In the distance, a few more black dots appeared in the sky. They were the pursuers who were following behind. In theory, only 8th-level Supreme Mages could fly freely without the help of an artifact, but if they had a precious flying magic device, a high-level 6th-level mage could also fly in the sky. In short, the strength of the pursuers must not be weak. The shuttle landed in the barracks and lost control, plowing a deep trench in the sand. The Supreme Mage Cezanne, who was driving the shuttle, retracted his magic, and the shuttle turned into a palm-sized artifact. He and the warrior behind him were both thrown out and fell to the ground unconscious. Soldiers had already rushed up to them and carried them to the big tent for treatment. Cezanne had already entered the safe zone. The flying sand curtain wall that protected the barracks was swept away by the wind. The shock of the sand shot into the air like countless arrowheads, like a burst of yellow smoke, blocking the pursuers flying in the distance. The mages were ready to fight, and the soldiers also raised their bows and arrows, waiting for the enemy to come into range. At this moment, there was a sound of a bowstring, and a silver light slanted into the sky, hitting a flying shuttle that was chasing after them. There was a sound of an explosion in the air, and a distorted shadow swelled. The magic device had lost control, and turned into a palm-sized artifact. Two people fell from the sky and smashed heavily on the sand dunes outside the barracks, motionless. Commander Amon was already standing on top of a chariot, holding the magic bow made from the tusks and tendons of the two-headed serpent in his hand. What he shot was not a poisonous arrow made from the stinger of a scorpion, but a heavy arrow forged from damask steel, plated with heavy silver, and engraved with magic patterns. This kind of arrow was specially prepared for supreme warriors who had undergone the second awakening of power. It required a special strong bow to be effective, and ordinary warriors would not be able to shoot it at all. The amazing power of this arrow, shot by Amon with the help of magic, was far greater, and had a longer range than the arrows shot by ordinary supreme warriors. His magic arts were actually more advanced than his body arts. The magic power contained in the arrow had reached the limit that the magic array engraved on it could bear, and the bow in Amon's hand was much more magical than the strongest battle bow issued by the army. The pursuers in the air saw that Cezanne had fled into the barracks, and they could not fight against an entire legion. In the face of the counterattack of the magic array, they all flew high into the sky, ready to retreat as soon as they saw the enemy camp clearly. The flying shuttle that Amon shot down was a flying shuttle controlled by a 6th-level mage. The mage had originally flown very high, far away from the range of the long-range weapons in the barracks. He thought that he was safe, but when he turned in the air and was about to fly back, Amon's arrow had already arrived. No one had expected such an accurate and powerful arrow to be shot in such a short encounter. Even George, who was watching the battle from the main formation in the air, was amazed, and the soldiers burst into thunderous cheers. The pursuers in the air had already turned around and gone far away. They seemed to be frightened by the power of Amon's arrow, and did not dare to stay in the air for a moment. The enemy's situation was unclear, and George did not dare to rashly send mages to chase after them. Including the soldiers, servants, laborers, and logistical teams, a total of more than 20,000 people, they had marched thousands of miles until now, and only one arrow had been shot in the official battle. This arrow was enough to establish Amon's position in the Legion, and those who saw him shoot this arrow were all in awe. But Amon himself was very dissatisfied with this arrow. He thought back to the earth-shattering arrow he had seen shot by the mysterious assassin at the blessing ceremony. Now he used his best bow to shoot the heaviest magic arrow with all his strength, but the power was still far from comparable to that arrow, even though he was now a supreme warrior and a supreme sorcerer. But Amon was very satisfied with his own legion. Although it was only a small scene of 5 or 6 enemies flying over, it was the first time this legion had encountered a head-on battle. No one panicked, and even the archers did not shoot indiscriminately. The ranks of the mages and the soldiers were set up in the shortest time possible. Even if a large army attacked, they would be able to calmly resist. It seemed that after some training and consolidation, this miscellaneous legion had become a fighting force that could not be underestimated. Although it was still not comparable to the elite legions of the Empire, it was definitely not vulnerable. The pursuers retreated, and the 2 men who had fled into the camp were unconscious. George had already recognized the other man. He was the captain of His Majesty Pharaoh's personal guards, Vega, a 7th-level supreme warrior. The personnel of the Horus Legion was much better than that of the Inare Legion. A 7th-level supreme warrior like Vega was only a captain of Pharaoh's personal guards, while a 7th-level supreme mage like Cezanne was only a captain of the mages under Ricard. These 2 men had obviously broken through from the direction of the main battlefield. Did they encounter an emergency situation that forced Pharaoh to send them to the Inare Legion? Madanzo found a roll of documents on the unconscious Cezanne. As expected, it was an emergency order from Pharaoh. Amon and George were shocked after reading it. Igut's main army was not doing well on the northern edge of the desert. To be more precise, it had suffered a great defeat. The Legion of Set led by Roddik was scattered, while the Legion of Isis led by Ankh was divided into 2 parts. One part joined Pharaoh's Horus Legion, while the other part was also defeated. At present, Pharaoh was besieged by the Hittite army on the edge of the desert, and was in a precarious situation. The Inare Legion was urgently ordered to leave the coastline and head east for reinforcements to cover Pharaoh's army's breakthrough. The order also specifically emphasized that they should bring enough supplies. After reading the order, Amon and George looked at each other for a long time. They did not express their opinions first, but asked John, who was sitting beside them, what did he think? The straightforward John slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "What kind of war is this? It's one thing to change the marching plan at a whim, but they left us at the seaside for more than 3 months, and when the main force is defeated and they need scapegoats, they think of us?" George advised in a low voice, "General John, now is not the time to vent your personal grievances. No matter how dissatisfied you are, you have to focus on the overall situation. In your opinion, how can we complete Pharaoh's order?" This question was very skillful. How could an order be completed? Under normal circumstances, it was only necessary to carry it out directly. However, Pharaoh's order to break camp and head east was tantamount to leaving the coastline and being separated from the rear supply fleet. In theory, they could station troops at the seaside, unload the goods from the temporary port, and use the fleet to organize logistics transportation. However, this would easily be cut off by the other party's army of Nanner, and they would become a lone army deep in the desert. If they were entangled by the other party in the desert, the entire army would be finished once they ran out of water, not to mention provisions. The army of Nanner did not even need to fight to the death, they only needed to exhaust them in the desert. Moreover, the overall combat power of the Inare Legion was not as good as the army of Nanner. Pharaoh's order was equivalent to sending this legion to their deaths. It was nothing more than to attract the Hittite kingdom's troops to cover the main force's breakthrough. Madanzo, who was standing beside Amon, frowned and said, "Pharaoh also ordered us to bring all the provisions on the spot. Since Roddik's logistics legion was scattered in the desert, I think the provisions and arrows in Pharaoh's army must have been almost consumed. If we really do that, our marching speed will be very slow, and we will be easily surrounded in the desert. If we want to rescue Pharaoh, we should raid lightly, but that way we can only bring 6 days' worth of water at most, which is not in line with Pharaoh's requirements." George touched the bracelet on his wrist and added with a bitter smile, "If we use my spatial artifact to carry supplies with all our strength, we can carry at most 1 more day's worth of provisions and water for the Legion's combat troops." Amon asked again, "The mention of spatial artifacts reminds me that there must be more than one Supreme Mage in Pharaoh's army. There are 2 9th-level Supreme Mages in the 3 legions alone. In addition to Cezanne, who broke through the encirclement today to deliver the letter, there are another 6 Supreme Mages. They should also have more sophisticated spatial artifacts. How many military supplies can they carry?" George shook his head and said, "Part of the Legion of Set and the Legion of Isis have been scattered. Even if all the Supreme Mages are safe and sound and reunited with Pharaoh, their spatial artifacts are full of military supplies. I am afraid that they can only last for 10 days or half a month. Moreover, the spatial artifacts of Supreme Mages are usually used for other purposes. It is impossible to use them all to carry provisions and water. Logistics and military supplies are mainly transported by convoys." John touched the back of his head and said, "In your opinion, should we carry out Pharaoh's order?" George glared at him and said, "How can a military order not be carried out? But this order was not received by us. It was found from the unconscious Supreme Mage Cezanne. It still needs to be confirmed. We have to wake him up." Amon was silent for a long time, finally looked up and said, "Pharaoh's order is that he hopes the Inare Legion can help the main force out of danger. As long as we can find a way to complete this task, it will be considered as carrying out the order. There are 2 urgent matters at hand. One is to ask the chief priest George to hurry up and personally use healing magic to wake up the messenger. In addition, no matter what action the Legion carries out, we must clearly investigate the enemy's distribution. This also requires the help of the chief priest George. Fly me to the battlefield to see the enemy's arrangement." John and Madanzo said in unison, "Are you 2 going to fly to the battlefield to see the enemy's situation in person? This is too risky." Amon also smiled bitterly and said, "Risky? Is there anyone else in our legion who can carry out this task and have the confidence to return safely? At least Lord George and I can escape if we encounter an accident, but if the army acts rashly and falls into a tight encirclement, we won't even be able to escape." After the emergency treatment of the priests, the 2 messengers were out of danger. At midnight, the Supreme Warrior Vega was the first to wake up and struggled to tell what had happened in the desert. Pharaoh led the Horus Legion forward without any obstacles along the way, smoothly crossing 700 miles of the desert, and was about to launch a sudden attack on the Enlil Legion when the Legion of Set, which was responsible for logistics, was ambushed. The ambushers had obviously undergone special targeted training. The soldiers were hidden under the sand in cloaks and did not encounter the Horus Legion, but at night, they inexplicably emerged from the desert on both sides, catching Roddik off guard. Chapter 126. Pharaoh was furious and ordered the rear of the Horus Legion to return to support. At the same time, he ordered the Legion of Isis to surround and destroy the enemy ambushing in the desert. At this moment, the Hittite Legion took the initiative to attack from the north. King Lucier was not in the army, and the commander was actually Goliath. Not only was the Enlil Legion here, but also the Legion of Anu led by Goliath. The ambush on the Legion of Set in the desert was the masterpiece of a surprise attack team specially trained by the Legion of Anu. Pharaoh made mistakes in both the command and the judgment of intelligence. He thought that he would use the strength of 2.5 legions to attack one of the enemy's legions. As a result, when the real battle began, he found that the other side had 2 elite legions to attack, and only the Horus Legion beside him could enter the battle first. The Legion of Isis behind was still gathering the scattered Legion of Set, and sorting out the remaining supplies. The combat power of the Horus Legion was very strong, but they trekked across the desert to carry out a surprise attack, while the other 2 legions were waiting at ease. This battle lasted for 3 days and 3 nights at the junction of the desert and grassland. The Horus Legion's continuous charge did not break through the opponent's line of defense, and the countercharge commanded by Goliath finally broke through the Horus Legion's battle formation. In the first battle, Pharaoh was defeated. The Horus Legion had to retreat and regroup, but Goliath would not give Pharaoh a chance. He commanded the 2 legions to outflank the Horus Legion from the left and right in an attempt to wipe out the Horus Legion. At this time, the situation of the battle had been reversed. The Horus Legion was exhausted, and it was difficult for them to fight again. Fortunately, the Legion of Isis arrived in time and launched an encounter with the Hittite army who was about to form an encirclement. This was a chaotic battle. It had only lasted for a day and a night, but the scene was extremely tragic. Both sides had more casualties than the previous battle. From the looks of it, they were evenly matched. The Igut army was only at a slight disadvantage, and barely managed to stabilize their position. However, the Legion of Isis that lagged behind were defeated by the outflanking Hittite army. When the ambush failed and they entered the battlefield, Pharaoh's army fell into a predicament. They only managed to gather an exhausted division of more than 1 legion. Facing 2 elite legions of Hittite that were full of fighting spirit, they were in a dilemma. If they continued to advance, they would not be able to defeat Hittite's army. If they retreated, they would lose most of their supplies. It would be difficult for them to lead the army safely across the Saya Desert. The Hittite army did not form a tight encirclement. They only guarded the water source outside the desert, and constantly launched harassment charges to deplete the strength of Pharaoh's army. They seemed to be waiting for Pharaoh's army to retreat. Once this exhausted division turned around and retreated into the desert, morale would be low and there would be a shortage of food and water. The Hittite army would attack from behind. The Igut army would definitely collapse or even be completely annihilated. The Igut army did not sit still and wait for death. With no way out, they launched a desperate attack. They pushed forward and occupied a place with a water source, obtaining fresh water supplies. At that time, the Hittite army strategically retreated to create a gap. When the Igut army had just set up camp, they launched a counterattack from 3 sides, forcing the Igut army to retreat to a corner of the desert. After a few rounds of this, the Igut army suffered heavy losses and was exhausted. They could no longer launch an active attack. They could only stay in their camp and wait for reinforcements. Reinforcements could come from 2 directions. The first was the reinforcements of the Igut army. After half of the Legion of Set was broken up, Julian had already escorted Roddick back to the Cape States. On the one hand, she gathered the remaining troops, and on the other hand, she organized the officers and soldiers who stayed in the city and the emergency conscription of the reserve army, preparing to rescue and reinforce the main army. However, distant water could not quench the present thirst. The situation of the Igut army was already very critical. The frontline command suggested that Pharaoh break out of the encirclement alone under the protection of the supreme mages. But this would be a complete defeat, and the glory of Pharaoh would also be greatly damaged. The army in the desert would face the result of total annihilation. Lazith too was unwilling to accept this. The closest reinforcements to the main battlefield were the Inare Legion, which had not yet entered the battle and had a complete lineup. Pharaoh ordered the Inare Legion to go east as reinforcements, even if it was only to attract the enemy's forces to cover the retreat of the main army or buy time. It was not easy to send this order across more than 300 miles of desert. The road on the ground had long been cut off by the Hittite army, so they could only send the mages. Pharaoh sent a total of 5 shuttles. The first 4 were all cover to attract the enemy's intercepting firepower. The shuttle led by the Supreme Mage Cezanne and the Supreme Warrior Vega was the real main force to break out of the encirclement. The two did not disappoint Pharaoh's great trust. They finally broke through the heavy obstruction and brought the order to the NRA Legion. The awakened Supreme Warrior Vega finished telling the story. Amon and George both comforted him to rest well, and said that the NRA Legion would do its best to rescue Pharaoh from danger. Vega fell into a deep slumber again. Apart from his serious injuries, it was also because of Ida's divine incantation that he fell into a deep slumber again. Cézanne's body was obviously not as strong as that of the Supreme Warrior, and he had not woken up yet. Coming out of the tent, Amon and George went to a secluded place to discuss in secret. Amon said, "There's no time to lose. If you want to fly and scout the camp, I suggest you take advantage of the night to act and find out the enemy's situation before making a decision." George shook his head and said, "Look at the sky full of stars. The vigilant Supreme Mage can see more clearly, and the vigilance at night will be higher. In fact, it will be easier to expose the target. The operation of a large legion can't be carried out at will. If you order us to prepare for the march now, it won't be too late for us to wait for half a day. During the day, when the sun is high in the sky, the sunlight on the desert is dazzling, which will interfere with the observation and detection of magic. It is more suitable for flying and scouting. It would be better if there are clouds at low altitude." Amon asked again, "How many flying artifacts are distributed in total?" George sighed and said, "The wind shuttle is the standard flying artifact on the continent. It is very fast and the production method is relatively mature, but the cost of building it is too high. The NRA Legion has 5, all of which are the property of the Empire, not the personal artifacts of the mages." Amon thought for a moment and said, "In fact, we have 7 flying artifacts now. Cézanne brought one, and I shot down one during the day." George smiled bitterly and said, "Of course, Cézanne's shuttle will be returned to him later, but we can use it temporarily. The shuttle you shot down is the Legion head's personal trophy. You can keep it for yourself. It doesn't violate any rules of the Empire. In fact, it's useless to have more. Including me, we only have 5 mages who can operate the shuttle. The number of masters we have is far less than the number of Horus or the Legion of Isis." George still missed 2 people. Both Amon and Madanzo could operate the wind shuttle, but the others didn't know about it. Amon shot down 2 people with 1 arrow during the day. They weren't killed by arrows, but fell to their deaths from a high altitude. At that time, an enemy mage and a warrior were operating the wind shuttle in pursuit of Cézanne, and Amon shot them into the shuttle. The enemy warrior couldn't stop the arrow at all, and the pilot was a 6th-level mage. He tried to use the spatial power of the shuttle to defend himself, but the impact of the arrow was so great that it even carried a continuous burst of energy, like a tidal wave. The strange tremor impact was even stronger than the force of the arrow. The mage was caught off guard and lost control of the shuttle. As a result, he fell from the sky together with the warrior. Of course, their staffs, weapons, and even the shuttle became Amon's trophies. The shuttle was a little damaged, but it was easily repaired in Amon's hands. It was much easier than collecting materials to build a new one. It was also an unexpected gain. Amon didn't elaborate on this. He thought for a moment and said to George, "Can you give me another shuttle for the time being? It may be useful in case of emergencies." Even if a supreme warrior had gone through the second awakening of his power, it was still difficult for him to master the most esoteric flight magic of the high-order spatial magic and air magic, not to mention using both at the same time. It was almost impossible for him to operate the wind shuttle. But George didn't even ask about it, and gave Amon a wind shuttle. Amon returned to his commander's tent with the 2 shuttles. Madanzo was still guarding outside the tent with his guards. Amon asked, "Is my cat back?" Madanzo replied, "Lord Schrödinger just came back and went straight into the back tent." Amon actually took a cat with him on the march, and this cat's food and drink were personally served by the head of the Legion every day. It was resting in Amon's tent. Schrödinger was very arrogant, which showed how much Amon doted on it. The guards jokingly called the cat Lord Schrödinger, which was also a kind of flattery. Over time, the joke became a habit, and even Madanzo called it that way. During the day, when the accident happened, Schrödinger slipped out and disappeared. Amon had urgent matters to deal with, and didn't have time to deal with it. Now that he learned that Schrödinger had returned, he was relieved. He walked into the tent and saw Schrödinger squatting in the seat of the Legion commander in the middle of the tent. He just smiled, then took out the utensils like a magic trick, and made a pot of fragrant broth for Schrödinger, because Schrödinger hadn't eaten since the day. Schrödinger sat in the seat of the commander, and finished the food in an ostentatious manner. It stretched out its paw and scratched the table in front of it twice, then meowed a few times at Amon. Amon had been with this cat for many years. Even if Schrödinger couldn't speak, he could probably guess what it wanted to do just by looking at its expression and movements. He immediately brought a large plate covered with fine sand, and placed it in front of Schrödinger. He said, "You went out for a while. Did you find something? Do you have something to tell me?" A cat's sharp claws were usually retracted in the meat pad, and would only be stretched out when catching mice and the like. But Schrödinger's claws were very interesting. It could retract the other claws and only stick out the tip of one of its claws, just like a person sticking out a finger and starting to draw on a sand table. First, it drew a semicircle along the edge of the sand table with 5 points in it. Then it drew a line on the other side with the words "Army of Nanner" written on it. Then it drew a line in the distance with the words "Ambush" written on it. Amon had already understood that this was the distribution map of the battle lines of all sides on the battlefield. Schrödinger was clearly reminding him that the Hittite army had long expected that the Nra legion would go to reinforce the pharaoh, and had set up an ambush in the desert, waiting for him to go over. As long as the Nra legion went deep into the desert, and was tired from marching with heavy supplies, they would be ambushed by the Enlil legion, and the legion of Anu in the most unfavorable terrain. The army of Nanner would also take the opportunity to cut off the supply line, and outflank them from the back. There was no need to fight a tough battle, they just needed to trap them to death. Schrödinger's claws did not stop. He drew a frame behind the line of defense of the army of Nanner, near the southern part of the charcoal marsh, and wrote "King of Hittite" inside. Amon, who was sitting opposite, could not help but stand up and exclaim in a low voice, "Schrödinger, what did you say that the King of Hittite is in this position?" Schrödinger nodded like a cat, then stretched out his claws and erased all the traces on the sand table. This information was too important to make Amon reconsider, and adjust the overall battle plan. Pharaoh was fooled. He thought that the King of Hittite was stationed with the Enlil legion on the south bank of the inland lake. In fact, the Enlil legion was indeed there, but the King Lucier himself was in the rear, and Goliath had also quietly gathered there with the main force of the Legion of Anu. How did Goliath accomplish all this without Igut's detection? In addition to sending different spies to spread false information, and blocking the border to prevent scouts from discovering it, there should be other means. For example, he could order soldiers to disguise themselves as servants or peasants, mix them into the logistics team that transported supplies or built strongholds, and then transport them bit by bit, and then complete the assembly. As long as the route of the main force of Igut had been determined, the decisive battlefield had been decided. The Hittite army did not change the arrangement of the legion on the surface, and even deceived the supreme mages flying reconnaissance. Seeing the map drawn by Schrödinger, especially pointing out the location of the King of Hittite, a plan gradually emerged in Amon's mind. Because this plan was too risky and bold, he still had to carefully consider all the details, and tomorrow he would investigate in person. Shortly after sunrise the next morning, the sun on the desert was already very strong, and the light white sand reflected very dazzling white light. Amon ordered Madanzo and John to strengthen the defense, and quietly left the camp with the chief priest George, behind a hidden sand dune in the distance. After making sure that there was no one nearby, George took out a magic item and said, "Commander, let's go." Amon was slightly startled and said in a low voice, "Crystal shuttle? Lord George actually has such a good thing?" George replied with a slight sigh, "Lord Amon really has a good eye. To be able to recognize the crystal shuttle at a glance, you must be an expert in all kinds of magic items, right? Many years ago, an old friend taught me how to make this, but unfortunately I had neither the ability nor the financial resources at that time. Later, I was fortunate enough to become an honorary high priest of the Temple of Isis, and later became an official high priest, so I had enough financial resources and energy to make such a magic item, which I succeeded not long ago. It is my precious private collection, and also a memento of the past. The thing in George's hand was like a small translucent plate, with a ventusum in the middle and 3 aquaticores symmetrically on the edges. The parangons and the magic item seemed to be naturally connected, and no one knew what kind of magical method was used to make it. Just the materials used to make such an item were already astoundingly expensive, not to mention how many times it had to be damaged before it could be made. One could only imagine how precious it was. George steered the crystal shuttle, and quietly rose into the sky with Amon. From a close distance, the space transformed by the crystal shuttle looked like a hazy, translucent reflection of light and shadow, and from a distance, it was impossible to see any trace of it at all. When it flew high into the sky, the crystal shuttle became even more invisible, and when it encountered clouds, it could also be revealed like a gray or white mist, like a cloud floating in the sky. After flying high into the sky, the crystal shuttle turned into a misty cloud, which was more magical than the translucent state of light and shadow. George then said to Amon, "The crystal shuttle also has a stealth effect, which can avoid the detection of detection magic. If we keep a safe distance, even a supreme mage will not be able to find us. If I didn't have this thing in my hand, I wouldn't have dared to take Lord Amon to explore the camp." Amon nodded and said, "I've heard of this kind of flying magic item, but it's too difficult to make. This is the first time I've seen someone successfully make it. Although its stealth effect is good, the people on it can't easily use magic to attack the outside, otherwise it will lose the purpose of stealth. It also has a weakness, that is, its speed is much slower than the wind shuttle." George held his staff in one hand and took out a wind shuttle with the other. He said, "It doesn't matter, we'll just scout high in the sky and try not to be discovered. If we are discovered, the two of us can't fight the army no matter how capable we are. Let's put away the crystal shuttle and escape with the wind shuttle. When the time comes, Supreme Warrior Amon, don't forget to cover our escape with magic arrows." The two talked as they headed east. Although the speed of the crystal shuttle was not as fast as the wind shuttle, as a flying magic item, it was certainly not slow. By noon, they had already flown across the desert and approached the main battlefield. Seeing the camps of the two armies in the distance, Pharaoh's army was stationed at the edge of the desert, only a few dozen miles away from the nearest water source. Obviously, more than one battle had broken out between the camp and the water source. Broken weapons could be seen scattered on the ground, reflecting the sun. The Hittite army's banners were neat and tidy, in a state of encirclement on 3 sides, and on both sides of the desert to the south where Pharaoh might have retreated, they had arranged patrol teams along the way. Schrödinger was right. There was a heavy line of defense on the road to meet the Inare Legion, waiting for Amon to walk into the trap. At present, Pharaoh's army was unable to attack and could only defend passively. The Hittite army could calmly deploy their elites to meet the Inare Legion. It was too high up in the sky to see all the details, and there might be other ambushes on both sides of the desert. Roddick had suffered such a loss before. Chapter 127. The army of Nanner had built several strategic strongholds on the border with the coastal camp as its base and Saya in the north as its support. The front line was relatively wide, and it was impossible for a supreme mage to use detection magic to scan the sky at all times over such a long distance, so it was not difficult to find weak points in the defense line to penetrate. South of the charcoal marsh, near the newly emerged inland lake, was originally barren and desolate with bare hills, and not far away was the Gobi Desert. But after the flood, the environment here changed, lush jungles grew, and there were many wild animals and some weak monsters. Amon had come here last time when he and Madanza were inspecting the landscape. In an open grassy area between the jungles, they found a group of people on horseback, actually hunting. And in a secluded location at the foot of the mountain not far away, there was a large gorgeous tent. There were guards around the tent, and from a distance, they were clearly not ordinary soldiers, but rather the personal guards of some great man. Judging from the lineup, There should be very few people who could have such a large number of personal guards. It was now the time for the decisive battle between the two countries, and there were actually people playing and hunting behind the battle line, and even setting up such a gorgeous camp. This was very surprising. Even the head of the army would not have the courage to do so, would he? George wanted to fly lower and closer to get a closer look, but Amon stopped him and said, "We can't get any closer, there must be a supreme mage there, maybe he is always on guard." At this moment, George frowned and said, "The crystal shuttle has a response, someone just inadvertently swept the sky with detection magic. Although it is far away and not enough to find us, that person is definitely a supreme mage. We are now deep behind the enemy. Once we are exposed, it will be very troublesome. We really can't get any closer." The faint cloud in the sky quietly drifted away with the wind, and Amon on the crystal shuttle muttered, "Who can come here to hunt at this time, and even have a supreme mage guarding him?" The two of them looked at each other and made their own guesses. Amon already had an idea, but George was so shocked that he couldn't close his mouth for a long time. Amon looked solemn and said, "Let's go back. I have a plan to discuss in detail. Although it is very risky, it is much safer than the army leaving the coastline and going deep into the sea. It depends on whether you agree or not." At dusk, the two returned to the main camp of the NRA Legion. The senior generals of the Legion had a secret discussion in the main tent for the whole night. The next day, the army of Nanner of the Hittite kingdom in the north received a report from the scouts. The NRA Legion had indeed left the coastline and marched towards the desert in the east. This was exactly as the kingdom's frontline command had predicted. The NRA Legion had set off early in the morning. The vanguard consisted of about 1,500 people, and the flag of the commander was among them. It seemed that they were all elites. However, the main camp by the sea did not withdraw. 2/3 of the NRA Legion still remained in the camp. Oreben, the commander of the army of Nanner, gathered the generals to judge the purpose of Amon's march. Vivian analyzed. The enemy is relatively cautious. He sent elite combat troops to open the way in front, and after clearing the obstacles, he will send a heavy escort of military supplies to follow. This way, he can fight and retreat at the same time, and he will not panic when he is blocked. The commander of the Legion, Amon, is at the forefront. Oreben added, "Lord Goliath has specially reminded us that although the combat effectiveness of the NRA Legion is very average, the commander of the Legion, Amon, is the one who is most familiar with the terrain in this area, more familiar than all of our commanders." Vivian smiled coldly. "So what? This is a battle of the Legion, not an adventure for him alone. The NRA Legion is going to die. We found Pharaoh's order from the messenger that we intercepted. Amon is only carrying out the order. He has no other way to go. Commander, when do you think is the best time for us to attack?" Oreben replied, "The order I received is very simple. If the miscellaneous legion does not move, we do not need to worry about it. If they move closer to the main battlefield, we will advance along the coastline to cut off their reinforcements and attack from the back. Now I will give the order to prepare to attack and monitor the movements of the enemy. If the supply team in the main camp has also set off, we will attack when they have just set off." Vivian reminded, "You have to attack his follow-up troops. Be careful that the vanguard will turn back and attack." Oreben asked, "How strong can this miscellaneous legion be? If the vanguard is forced to retreat, my goal will be achieved. The NRA Legion will still stay where they are. When the situation on the main battlefield is settled, won't they be meat sent to my mouth? It depends on my mood when I want to eat them." The army of Nanner gathered their elites and was ready to go. However, after waiting for a whole day, Amon's vanguard had already moved far away in the desert. There was still no movement from the main camp by the sea. The soldiers of the army of Nanner were already neatly equipped and tired. Oreben and Vivian were puzzled. They did not know what Amon was up to. Was the commander only going to save Pharaoh with 1,500 lightly equipped soldiers? If Amon had really made such a decision, then his level of military command was simply that of an idiot. However, anything could happen in this world. It was said that the commander was an ordinary warrior who had never led an army to war before. The situation on the battlefield needed to be adjusted according to the changes. Oraben immediately decided to wait for Amon to move further away from the main camp. Then he could calmly lead his troops to cut in from the back and kill them. The soldiers had been tense for a whole day. Oraben ordered the officers and soldiers to temporarily take off their armor and rest. They would take action the next morning. Unexpectedly, urgent reports came in one after another. Amon, who was marching slowly, suddenly changed direction and turned north from the desert. He led 1,500 vanguard troops and launched a fierce attack on the defensive line of the army of Nanner. This battle was very strange. It was completely out of the norm and out of everyone's expectations. Amon led the cavalry and chariots. The throwers with long shields and the archers in light leather armor also boarded the chariots. They only brought 3 days' worth of food and water with them, so they were quite mobile. During the day, they marched slowly and deliberately to save their strength. At night, they suddenly rushed north and quickly rushed to the army of Nanner's 2 strategic fortresses along the border. Half of the main force of the army of Nanner was gathered in the camp by the sea, waiting to attack. The rest of the troops were lined up along the border and relied on the fortifications for defense. Although they had a great advantage in a defensive battle, Amon had concentrated 1,500 elites into a single point of attack. There were only slightly more than 300 regular defenders in the 2 fortresses at the front line. Although they were under close surveillance, Amon's change of direction was too sudden, and the speed of the march was too fast. He had no intention of attacking the fortresses. He only wanted to break through the defensive line and advance toward Saya. The defenders resisted with all their might, but Amon still broke through the defensive line. Amon let the chariots charge forward on both flanks while he led his personal cavalry to form the arrowhead in the middle. As they approached the defensive line, the archers on the chariots unleashed a concentrated volley of arrows under the cover of the javelin throwers' shields. As they charged forward, the javelin throwers also fired their spears. On this small front line, the sky was covered in arrows and spears, making the ground look like a hedgehog. As soon as the guards raised their heads from behind the bunker, Madanzo and his personal guards had already rushed over. They were the first to rush over the fence while waving a heavy sword. The 1,500 chariots and cavalrymen charged at full speed, accompanied by the dense volley of arrows and spears. Amon led his troops and trampled over them, only losing a few dozen cavalrymen. Apart from a few defenders who escaped back to the fortress, there were nearly 200 casualties. In the first battle of the Nra Legion, Amon won a resounding victory. This victory was too important for the soldiers of the Nra Legion. They had never fought a war before, and in their hearts, they had always thought that this legion was a useless miscellaneous army. After Amon's reorganization, they won such a great victory in the first battle. Imperceptibly, their confidence and morale were greatly boosted. It turned out that the enemy was just SOSO. Many people who were fighting on the battlefield would not calm down and think carefully about the circumstances under which this victory was obtained. But if this victory was put in the overall situation of the battle, it would seem extremely foolish. Shrinking the mobile forces and charging at full speed to break through the defensive line, while the enemy's strength and combat power were stronger than their own. This was a tactic that would only be used when escaping. Even if Amon wanted to escape, he fled in the wrong direction, and actually fled into the territory of the Hittite kingdom. How could there be such a stupid commander in the world? Although the enemy was caught off guard for a while, as long as they took advantage of the situation to withdraw their forces, they could directly chop Amon's lone army into mincemeat. However, when Commander Oraben received the urgent report, he was shocked. According to the normal battle command, he only needed to order the defensive line to withdraw in place and cut off Amon's escape route. At the same time, he could attack from both flanks. When the enemy was exhausted, he would naturally be captured. However, Oraben did not dare to give such an order. Instead, he ordered the troops on both flanks of the defensive line to return and must intercept Amon in front. At the same time, the main force of the army of Nanner, who had just dismounted and rested, hurriedly moved out. The light cavalry was in front, the chariots followed, and the heavy cavalry and infantry also set off in order to fight with Amon at the fastest speed. The reason was very simple. If Amon took the wrong medicine and went deep into the enemy's rear alone, although he would definitely die, he might encounter the Hittite king who was hunting at the rear. If he disturbed the king, Orban would not be able to bear the consequences. He had already patted his chest and assured His Majesty the king that it was absolutely safe there. He only needed to rest and wait for the news of victory. On the contrary, it was the chief priest who comforted him. His Majesty the king's camp is still far from the defensive line. The NRA legion's charging speed can't be that fast. Even if the people can persist, the war horses also need to rest. Not to mention the interception along the way. Our main force can definitely intercept him without disturbing His Majesty the king. Since they want to die, isn't it just right that they came? After dealing with this vanguard, the next step can be to easily uproot their camp by the sea. The credit of this battle will all be ours, and it will be right in front of the king's eyes. However, Amon's march once again exceeded the enemy's expectations. It was simply incredible. After breaking through the defensive line for more than 10 miles, it was already late at night. He ordered the officers and soldiers to rest in a huge sand dune. While watching the surrounding movements, he let the war horses rest and did not continue to advance to the enemy's rear. The night was not conducive for marching, and Amon also ordered the officers and soldiers not to light a torch or let out any light. The army of Nanner's defensive line had all rushed to the front to intercept. When Amon suddenly stopped marching, it was equivalent to leaving them behind. When the sky was slightly bright, the enemy realized that Amon did not advance, so they gathered their forces and advanced to fight with Amon. Meanwhile, the main force of the army of Nanner was about to arrive. At this time, Amon gave another order. All the officers and soldiers boarded the chariots and horses and galloped at full speed. Their destination was the NRA Legion's camp in the southwest. They had just been out for a day and a night, and they actually had to retreat at the fastest speed. The way to fight a war was to suddenly stab the enemy when they were unprepared, and then run away after taking a breath. It was not easy to escape. On the way back, they happened to meet the flank of the main force of the army of Nanner that was rushing over. They were lucky that they did not run into the main force head-on. This was because the army of Nanner's original marching direction was to intercept in the front. On the way, they heard that Amon was leading the army to retreat, so they chased from the side and the rear. The fastest light cavalry happened to meet them diagonally. This was a tough battle. The NRA Legion drove the chariots to the front, and the heavy cavalry protected the flanks. The battle formation of both sides was a mess. At the critical moment, the personal guards of the head of the legion formed the vanguard, but the leader was not the personal guard captain, Madanzo, but John, who was holding a shield in one hand and wielding a long-handled battle axe in the other. At this time, John seemed to have entered a state of madness. He swung his axe madly, and with a whirling silver light, under the protection of the armored guards, he charged directly into the center of the enemy's formation. His combat power was not weaker than that of a supreme warrior. The opponent's cavalry captain was caught off guard. John broke through the formation and rushed to the front of his horse. After a few rounds of fighting, he was cut down and fell off his horse. The commander of the NRA Legion's chariot was also missing Amon's figure. The commander of the battle was the Supreme Mage George with a staff in his hand. A team of 20 mages, under the protection of the chariots, also entered the battlefield. With the sound of chanting, rays of light fell, making the soldiers forget their pain and awakening the belief of victory and the strongest power. The soldiers of the NRA Legion had just experienced a great victory and had rested for half the night. Their morale was high. The opponent was only about 600 light cavalry that had arrived overnight. Although this battle was a head-on confrontation, they had broken through the light cavalry formation. They had no time to clean up the battlefield and collect the spoils of war. They still ran at full speed in the direction of their own camp. Chapter 128. The head of the legion disappeared. George ordered the middle army to move back. The mages formed a second line of defense not far in front of the chariots. The main force of the Nanner regiment finally arrived from the rear. After a night of marching, They saw that the light cavalry was scattered and the enemy was right in front of them. Their eyes were bloodshot as they chased after the enemy. The two sides launched a chase in the desert. No matter how strange Os' battle plan was, it still needed to be backed up by the fighting power of the soldiers. If they encountered an enemy who could not fight head-on, it would be useless no matter how clever the command was. Oroben was surprised to find that the NRA legion he was chasing was not as vulnerable as the rumors said. They advanced and retreated in an orderly manner. The soldiers were not timid. Although they were running at full speed, their battle formation did not change. The NRA legion marched very slowly, but they retreated very quickly. They fought and separated several times in the desert. There were hundreds of casualties, and many horses died of exhaustion. But in the end, the main force calmly retreated to the camp by the sea. Although he had heard the reports of the situation of Os' camp from the spies, Oroben was still surprised when he saw it with his own eyes. He wondered what I was doing. Was he planning to settle down here? In addition to the chariots brought for this mission, the rest of the NRA legion's chariots were lined up outside the camp and piled up with sand to form a semicircular defensive wall. Loose sand was easy to flow and was not suitable for building a wall. But the NRA legion used up the empty sacks used to transport food to fill the wet sand, and piled them up layer by layer. With the help of the chariots, it looked like a simple and solid wall. There were 5 gaps in the wall. The retreating NRA legion troops divided into 5 groups and rushed back to the camp like quicksand. Then there was silence. Looking up from outside the camp, many Hittite soldiers could not help but gasp. There were 5 tall fortresses in the camp. As it turned out, they had towed a large ship that was used to transport supplies ashore along the shoal, and placed it on the sand dunes. The hull of the ship was also protected by layers of sandbags, so that it could withstand fire and attack. The upper and lower 3 layers of the ship had become watchtowers that looked down from above. If they attacked from the gap in the wall, they would be faced with these 5 tall battle fortresses. There was nothing to defend in the desert, and there was almost no favorable terrain to use. The side with fortifications naturally had a great advantage in defense. The disadvantage was that such fortifications could not be moved and could only be defended. Os' order was for the entire army to defend the camp. Oroben had already led the main force of the army of Nanner to this place. It was impossible for him to retreat without a fight. He immediately ordered to attack the camp. The soldiers flooded towards the defensive wall. Surprisingly, they did not encounter any resistance. The other side was like an empty camp. The vanguard troops successfully rushed in through the 5 gaps. At this moment, the sound of the command was heard. Countless people suddenly appeared on the 5 fortresses. Arrows and spears were thrown like rain, but they were only aimed at the periphery of the city wall. The focus was on the gap, which happened to be at the edge of the range of the high ground. It temporarily stopped more enemies from pouring in. The commander of the Hittite army knew that only by taking down the 5 fortresses could they successfully capture the camp. He risked his life and launched a charge. At this time, the sword and shield soldiers of the NRA legion also lined up and rushed out from behind the fortresses. The first round of assault began in the narrow battlefield within the defensive wall. The soldiers who stayed behind to guard the camp were long prepared for this battle. Most of the vanguard troops of the army of Nanner that rushed into the wall were killed, and the rest retreated. After a probing battle, the army of Nanner deployed their tanks and heavy cavalry to launch an all-out assault. Many parts of the walls of the NRA legion's camp were destroyed. The battle revolved around the attack and defense of the 5 fortresses. The battle lasted for a full day and night. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, but the army of Nanner had no more strength to launch another attack. In the end, they did not manage to take down the camp. The army of Nanner was repelled. They had suffered a total of nearly 1,000 casualties in this series of battles. It could be considered a great defeat. The reason for the defeat was simple. First, they misjudged the enemy's situation. Second, they were in a disadvantageous position. Most importantly, they underestimated the enemy. The main force of the army of Nanner was nearly 3,000 people. They did not attack the camp at first, but were chased by the vanguard troops sent by Ah. It was impossible for Oroben to gather the entire legion to participate in this battle. However, The Aare Legion was organized with 5,000 people to defend the camp. Their military strength was almost double that of the enemy. The Aare Legion had the support of the walls and fortresses. They had the advantage in terms of defense. The side that forcefully attacked would suffer heavy casualties. This was enough to make up for the gap in combat strength between the two sides. The combat effectiveness of the Aare Legion was not as fragile as people had thought it would be. There were no mistakes in the defensive command, and the fighting style was impressive. Orban attacked angrily, but the result was that he could not take down the enemy's camp. He knew that he could not take down the enemy's camp. He had to withdraw his troops and retreat immediately. He also had to guard against the enemy's ambush from behind. The Aare Legion won all 3 battles, especially the defense battle. Although it was difficult, it was the most important victory. The enemy was greatly weakened. However, from a strategic point of view, they also missed 2 great opportunities. The first time was when the vanguard troops led by A broke through the defense line and led the main force of the army of Nanner away from the camp. The 3,000 soldiers of the Aare Legion could have taken the opportunity to attack the enemy's camp. The second time was when Orban retreated. The main force of the Aare Legion could have attacked from behind, not giving the enemy a chance to breathe. They could have won the battle. However, the Aare Legion did not do so. The battle plan that A and George made was to wait for the vanguard troops to retreat to the camp, and then firmly defend. The reason was simple. They did not have enough confidence in the Aare Legion's combat strength. They did not think that these soldiers could win in a head-on battle. After all, they were a miscellaneous army that had only undergone a few months of strict training. This was similar to playing chess. No matter how good one's chess strategy was, one had to look at the chess pieces in one's hand. If A was commanding the Horus Legion, he would not have let go of these 2 opportunities. What was intriguing was that when the army of Nanner attacked the camp, A and Guard Captain Madanza were not in the army. The supreme commander of the Aare Legion was George, and the frontline commander was John. After the retreat of the army of Nanner, the Aare Legion suffered a lot of casualties. They needed to rest and refortify the defense line. George did not hastily give the order to pursue. No matter what kind of army they were, they needed a real battlefield to sharpen their edge. The appearance of the Aare Legion was completely different from when they first left Montefiore. The changes that had taken place could be described as a rebirth. To be able to achieve such a victory in a real battle, the effect of the previous training had been sublimated. If they were to go out now, they would definitely dare to fight a big battle. The spirit of the soldiers was like a different person. The Supreme Mage Cezanne, who broke out of the main battlefield and rushed to deliver the order, finally woke up from his coma. As soon as he opened his eyes, he heard the battle cries not far away. In a panic, he asked the servant standing beside him, only to learn that the army of Nanner was attacking the camp. The mage was startled. He instinctively closed his eyes and prayed to the gods. Like the commanders of the other legions, Cezanne was not optimistic about the fighting strength of the Aare Legion. This time, he ordered the Aare Legion to go to the east to rescue them only because he had no other choice. It was nothing more than a way to attract the enemy's forces, and buy time for the main battlefield to breathe. To put it bluntly, they were just sacrificial pawns. It was not easy for him to deliver the order, but before the Aare Legion could set out, the enemy had already besieged them. In all likelihood, this place could not be defended. As a seriously injured Supreme Mage, he was afraid that he would also die here. However, Cezanne waited for a long time, but there were no sounds of fighting around the camp. Instead, the battle cries in the distance gradually subsided and finally calmed down. After asking around, he found out that the Aare Legion had actually repelled the enemy's attack. Not long after, Lord George came in and sat beside him, comforting him. "Lord Cezanne, I heard that you have woken up and immediately rushed over. Thank God, although your injuries are not light, the main reason is that you have consumed a lot of magic power. As long as you rest for a while, you will be fine. It's just that you can't use magic power for the time being. This may not be a bad thing. It may even be an opportunity for you to break through to the 8th level." Cezanne was not in the mood to talk about magic practice at this time. With the help of the servant, he struggled to sit up and asked, I heard the battle cries. Is it the Hittite army attacking? What is the situation of the battle? George smiled and said, We have seen the order you brought. Yesterday, we sent out a vanguard to rescue Pharaoh, but we were blocked by the army of Nanner on the way. We had to retreat back to the camp and fought a bitter battle. The enemy has been repelled. You just need to rest and recuperate. You will be absolutely safe in the NRA Legion. Suzanne said anxiously, I am not concerned about my safety, otherwise I would not have risked my life to break out of the encirclement and come here. The NRA Legion is fighting with the army of Nanner here. What about His Majesty Pharaoh? Where is His Excellency? I want to see the head of the Legion and announce the order of His Majesty Pharaoh in person. George replied, His Excellency has seen the order of His Majesty. When we were fighting with the enemy army here, the head of the Legion had personally gone to rescue Pharaoh. Suzanne was taken aback again. His Excellency went to rescue Pharaoh himself. How many troops and supplies did he bring with him? George said solemnly, He took all that he could. It doesn't matter how many people he brought with him. What's important is that we can turn the tide of this war. Otherwise, no matter how many victories we win here, it will not mean much. How many people did I bring with him? George did not dare to tell Suzanne the truth, otherwise the seriously injured mage would definitely fall from the sky. I only brought Madanzo, the captain of his personal guards. The rest of them did not even have a horse, let alone soldiers. Us portable spatial artifact was filled with a lot of supplies, barely enough for a legion to eat and drink. But he did not cross the desert to find Pharaoh's army. Instead, he sneaked into the rear of the enemy's formation with Madanzo. There are 2 updates today. The next chapter will be updated at 18:58 p.m. Smiley face. Chapter 129. The Boldest Risk. Not long after the NRA Legion's vanguard troops rested and retreated swiftly, not only did the main force of the army of Nanner pursue them, the troops that had gathered to obstruct them had also advanced forward. They carefully swept through the original battlefield, not leaving behind any remnants of the enemy. As the main force of the army of Nanner and the fleeing vanguard troops of the NRA Legion engaged in a grand chase, the vicinity of the sand dunes where Os garrison was resting had been plowed by the Hittite soldiers. After ascertaining that all the enemies had fled, the Hittite soldiers re-established their defensive line and continued to dispatch scouts nearby to maintain vigilance. And Madanzo had vanished during the middle of the night. They hadn't left their troops at that time, but nobody knew where they had gone. When the sun rose and they retreated, only George and John were left to lead the troops. On this very afternoon, at the edge of the desert dozens of miles away from that place, in a desolate and secluded area, 2 mounds of sand suddenly rose up on the flat ground between the large sand dunes. The sand rose up from the ground, and the top of the sand continued to pour down. Then 2 figures emerged from the sand. This scene was extremely strange, very similar to the scene when I first saw the Scorpion King. However, this time, there was a lot more movement, and there was almost no fluctuation of magic energy. The 2 figures that emerged from beneath the sand were and Madanzo. They had spent half a day hiding beneath the sand dunes and traversing dozens of miles, evading all the Hittite soldiers' search. Both of them were clad in strange scale armors, dark and non-reflective, without a single speck of sand on their bodies. Madanzo looked around and chuckled. This scorpion shell armor is truly miraculous. Not only can it defend against water and fire, it can also sneak under the sand. Link's craftsmanship is truly not bad, a pity he only crafted 2. They were wearing the armor made from the strange shell of the giant scorpion. When I was in the Savages tribe, he helped Link make the first one. After I left, Link made the second one independently. When Madanzo escorted Aesop to the Swamp Island to help Link, Link gave the scorpion shell armor to Madanzo for protection. Sure enough, it came in handy today. I patted the armor on his body and said, "It's really good stuff, but the materials are not easy to make. I've collected so many shells, but after making these 2 armors, there isn't enough left to make another one. Although the armor is good, it depends on the person wearing it. If it were someone else, They would have to undergo the second awakening and master advanced magic in order to make it. Madanzo smiled and said, I'm not a supreme warrior yet, but this armor is just right for me to wear. The practice habits that God usually teaches me are useful now. Wearing this armor and sneaking under the desert for half a day, I don't feel tired at all. The magic power I use is weak and lasting is just right. I looked at him and said, although you are not a supreme warrior, ordinary supreme warriors may not be your opponent. You have to be cautious, but you also have to be confident. You can't be timid. Madanzo said with a slight smirk. Of course, if not, would I dare to follow God on this trip? What should we do now? Should we set off to find the camp of the king of Hittite? I looked at the sky, then looked at the front, shook his head and said, in front of us is the grassland, and not far from here are the mountains and jungles. We can't sneak under the sand. In broad daylight, if someone flies over to investigate, they may find us. Madanzo said, use stealth magic. With our habit, we shouldn't be afraid to use magic at any time. I shook his head again and said, this habit is good during normal times. It is a way to train magic power. But what we have to do now is very dangerous. We must ensure that we have enough energy and physical strength. We have been in the desert for half a day. We can't waste any more energy. Moreover, we can't use all of our magic power while using stealth magic. A good mage can still find us if they are close. Put on the snake scale armor, and we will take the shortest route to hide in the swamp. Not only did they carry the scorpion shell armor with them, but also the snake scale armor made from the scales of the two-headed snake monster. This kind of scale armor was made with magic. It could be used to sneak in water or swamp without getting wet. It also required the user to master advanced magic. Madanzo said with a bitter face, we just got out of the sand, and now we have to go back to the mud? I also smiled bitterly and said, don't just think about prestige and glory. We have to suffer what we have to suffer. Now is not the time to act. We have to wait for George and John to lure away the main force of the army of Nanner. They are probably fighting in the desert now. Let's hope the camp can hold. The two quietly walked out of the desert and into the grassland. The scorpion shell armor had a faint reflection under the sun, but it soon became the same color as the environment. Their figures also became blurred. It was not easy to see them clearly in close proximity, let alone from afar. They did not go straight to King Hittite's camp. Instead, they took a big detour to the east and took the shortest route to the edge of a swamp. They put on the snake scale armor and quietly disappeared into the soft grass and muddy water. King Wuxia of Hittite was not in a good mood today. He followed the advice of the military minister Juguli and the other commanders. He left his flag in the Enlil Legion and retreated from the front line to the rear. It was rare for him to leave the capital and come to the border to relax. It was comfortable to ride and hunt every day, and it was exactly what he wanted. However, it was inevitable that he would get bored after a long time. It was said that the front line had achieved a great victory, but Goliath and the rest were still not ready to launch an all-out attack to capture the pharaohs of Igut. This made the king, who was waiting to establish this unparalleled achievement, a little anxious. Early this morning, they received an urgent report that Igut's NRA Legion had sent out a group of troops to break through the defensive line and charge towards the hinterland of Saya. Although it was far away and they would be blocked by many armies along the way, the guards around him still advised the king to be careful. It was better to retreat to the city for safety reasons. Wuxia was unhappy. He said with a sullen face, "This time, I am personally leading the army. Do I have to run away when there is enemy activity far away? Are the army of Nanner useless? Are you all useless? Are you all useless? Can't you protect me?" Wuxia was a little annoyed. Not only did he not retreat, he did not even change his camp. Of course, his troops were not useless. Not long after, they received another report that the enemy had been repelled. After suffering heavy losses, they fled in panic. The army of Nanner's commander had already led the army to chase the enemy back to their camp and launched an attack. On the second day, the official report came. The army of Nanner had repelled the enemy's elite troops and surrounded the enemy camp to launch a fierce attack. The NRA Legion did not dare to take a step out of their camp. General Orban led his main force and killed nearly 2,000 of the enemy's soldiers. The NRA Legion could no longer fight, and could only defend their camp. Orban's report was very interesting. It seemed that he had won a great victory. First he chased the NRA Legion and killed them all the way. Later, he pressed his opponent down and beat him until he was tired. Only then did he win. The number of 2,000 killed was quite an exaggeration. The official combat force of the NRA Legion was only about 5,000. Even if all the logistics team, servants and civilians were included, the total number was only 20,000. But this was how the report should be written. Orban also knew what the king liked to hear. When Wuxia saw the report, his mood turned for the better. Although he knew that Orban was definitely exaggerating, at least it showed that the defense line was fine and his position was safe. He was even proud of his calm decision yesterday. That day, the king brought his guards to the forest at the edge of the swamp to hunt. When they returned at night, they held a bonfire party in the camp. The king's camp was naturally grand. He lived in the most beautiful animal skin tent. In front of the tent, he used curtains to form a courtyard. In the courtyard, he lit a fire, roasted food and drank merrily. Delighted, King Wuxia even rewarded his attendants handsomely. That night, at the edge of the swamp closest to the king's camp, two people silently emerged from the muddy water. They were and Madanzo, who were wearing dark brown snake scales. The muddy water slid off their bodies, not staining them at all. If one were to find two people in the continent who were most familiar with the terrain of this area, it would definitely be and Madanzo. Back then, they had spent a long time traversing through layers of danger to conduct the most detailed investigation. The two of them spent a day and a half, circling around the swamp, avoiding all possible detection as they stealthily snuck into the position closest to the king's camp. Especially during the last part of the journey, they swam very carefully in the swamp. Even the scorpion-tailed dragon that was resting there wasn't startled. After reaching the shore, they entered the forest. They took off the snake scale armor and changed into the scorpion shell armor. Of course, this was because the scorpion shell armor had better defense. Tonight, they were about to face an unpredictable battle. Then they inspected the equipment they needed. Held the iron staff in his hand. That was his most familiar weapon. He also took out a Windrider shuttle and a few scrolls and gave them to Madanzo. Instructed in a low voice. I called you here to take a risk, but not to throw away your life for nothing. If the plan fails, activate the scrolls to cover yourself and quickly escape with the flying shuttle. You can't escape towards the southern battlefront. Head north into the swamp and go to Link. Madanzo didn't carry a staff, but a strange long sword. The hilt of the sword was very long, almost half the length of the blade. It looked like a sword with a short staff attached to it. The end of the hilt was also inlaid with a parangan, but it was fused into the material and invisible. This was a weapon that I obtained in the belly of the mysterious mountain. It was originally a precious sword of some supreme warrior, and was very suitable to support the casting of magic. Naturally, it was the best use for it to be given to Madanzo. Chapter 130. The two of them silently made their way through the dark forest towards Wuxia's camp. Halfway up a hill, they could already see the light of a fire in the camp. They stopped to rest for a while. A gust of wind blew, and Madanzo sniffed and whispered, "It's the aroma of scorpion-tailed dragon meat." They went hunting in the swamp during the day, and came back to roast meat at night. Their life is quite comfortable. It doesn't look like they are fighting at all. It's almost like an outing. Amon suddenly turned around and asked solemnly, "In your heart, there has always been a desire to take risks and to create unknown miracles. We are definitely taking a risk this time, and we will also create a miracle. What do you think of this?" Madanzo put his hand on his chest and said, "Ammonius, you really know me too well. Bringing me on this mission is completely in line with my temperament. My blood is almost boiling, full of enthusiasm and desire, but my heart is extremely calm, waiting for your command." Amon nodded and said, "Before taking action, think of the possibility of failure and be prepared to deal with it, and once you really take action, you can only think of how to succeed. If we can really succeed this time, it will be an incredible adventure and miracle. You will personally witness, experience, and accomplish all this, and maybe it will be the opportunity to break through to the 7th level. As I said long ago, this is a kind of spiritual sublimation. It can only be understood, not explained. Madanzo nodded thoughtfully and asked again. According to the results of your personal investigation a few days ago, there are about 80 guards around the king. How many masters do you think there are? Amon thought for a while and said, to be able to become the king's guards, they must be at least advanced warriors. There are strict rules on weapons and equipment, and they must meet the requirements of the guards of honor. They should be quite good, but the main thing is that they look impressive. Madanzo, how many supreme mages and warriors do you think there are? Amon, if we were in the capital, it would be hard to say, but now the situation is special. As far as I know, there are 4 9th-level supreme mages on both sides on the main battlefield. The elites must be at the front lines. It is impossible for too many people to accompany the king to hunt in the safety of the rear. The main force of the Enlil Legion has also been led away by us. It is impossible for there to be no masters in the wilderness in the middle of a war. The guard captain in charge of the king's camp here must be a supreme warrior. Lucier may also have a supreme warrior as his bodyguard. As for the supreme mage, there may be one no more. These forces are already quite strong. Madanzo subconsciously moved his shoulders and said in a low voice, Ammonius, can we deal with him? Amon said, we're already here, and we'll have to face them no matter what. It's impossible for the 2 of us to win if we fight them alone, but my goal is only to hold the king hostage. Hittite will be our bodyguard. After saying this, Amon inserted his staff into the ground, reached for his magic bow, and asked in a deep voice, are you ready? Madanzo also replied in a deep voice, I'm ready, you can start. He pulled out his sword, walked out of the shadow of the trees, and came to the hillside, where the starry sky was conspicuous. He looked up at the stars and put his hand on his chest and said to himself, bless Ammonius. Amon couldn't help but smile when he heard this. Why are you looking at the sky and calling my name? I'm standing behind you. Madanzo also smiled. Sorry, I'm used to it. While talking and laughing, Amon drew his bow and nocked an arrow. The speed at which his hand plucked the bowstring was as fast as a flying wheel. Arrows flew one after another in the night sky towards the king's camp. The trembling bowstring and flying arrows made almost no sound. No one could describe the strangeness of this archery. The speed at which the first arrow left the bowstring was obviously not very fast, but the arrows that followed were getting faster and faster. The arrows needed to fly a certain distance from the hillside to the camp. Amon shot 15 arrows in one breath, and almost all of them hit the target at the same time. The king's guards probably never dreamed that someone would sneak through the battle line to such a far position, and suddenly launch a silent attack on His Majesty the king's camp. Who could be so bold? The king's camp seemed to be heavily guarded, but the guards' mentality was quite relaxed, and they only maintained routine vigilance. There were strict rules for night guard duty. The position of the outpost must meet the requirements, and each guard must be in the line of sight of at least 2 other guards, forming a state of cross-surveillance to prevent people from sneaking in and taking out the outpost. If anything unexpected happened, the entire camp would quickly be alerted. Even the strictest rules needed people to carry them out. If someone occasionally got distracted, looked at the ants on the ground, looked at the stars in the sky, or turned their head and sneezed, they would instantly be out of the state of cross-surveillance. At this moment, there was a guard who was in a daze. He could not help but burp, probably because he had eaten too much barbecue at night. He put down his shield and spear with one hand, rubbed his stomach and looked down. At this moment, he suddenly felt a chill in his chest. An arrow flew from the dark night, piercing through his chest armor and into his heart. The arrow shaft with its tail was still trembling. His eyes widened as if he had seen the most incredible thing in the world. He stared at the half of the arrow shaft in his chest and wanted to shout, but he could not make a sound. When the arrow hit his body, there was a strange shockwave. His entire body, including his Adam's apple, could not move. However, he did not feel any pain from the wound. Instead, there was a kind of itchy and numb feeling spreading. Then his body became ice cold, and gradually became hot. He could not even move his little finger. The guard's hand involuntarily loosened, and his spear and shield fell to the ground. He also fell softly to the ground, armor and weapons making a crisp sound. The sound did not only come from this place, but the sound of weapons falling to the ground and guards falling to the ground came from the various outpost positions on this side of the camp almost at the same time. The arrow shot by Amon was a poisonous arrow made from a scorpion's hook. Not only could it take a person's life in an instant, but the strange power also made it impossible for people to call for help. But the sound of the guards falling to the ground and the collision of weapons and armor, Amon had no way of controlling it. Such a big movement must have alerted the other guards in the camp. A loud shout was heard. "There are assassins on the mountain protecting the king, guards, follow me." A warrior with disheveled hair rushed out with a group of guards, not even wearing armor. This man was the captain of the guards of the king of Hittites' temporary camp, the 7th level supreme warrior Aruka. He had been rewarded by the king at the banquet, and had drunk a few more glasses of wine, and had fallen asleep. Suddenly hearing the movement, the supreme mage Jonah, who was next to the king, also sent out an alarm in time. He didn't even put on his armor. He picked up his sword and rushed out with his guards. As soon as the soldiers looked up and saw Metatro on the hillside in the distance, they heard a sharp whistle that pierced through the night sky. Amon stood behind Medanzo and could see clearly in the shadows. He knew that as soon as the 15 guards fell to the ground, the people inside the camp would be alarmed, and there would definitely be a guard captain, or something like that rushing out with his men. As soon as Aruka's figure appeared, he fired an astonishingly powerful arrow. This time, it was not a poisonous arrow, but a heavy arrow made of damask, with a surface of heavy silver and engraved with magical patterns. Amon had once shot down a flying shuttle in the sky with an arrow in the army formation. At this moment, the arrow was even more powerful than before, and with a dazzling silver light, it struck like lightning. The arrow first reached Aruka's eyes, and the soldiers on both sides heard the sharp whistle that cut through the air. After all, Aruka was a supreme warrior. When he rushed out, he was vigilant and reacted in a hurry. He shouted and slashed out with his heavy sword with both hands. The deafening sound burst out with a dazzling silver light, and several soldiers around him were swept to the ground by the shock wave. Although Aruka blocked the arrow, his figure was knocked back and smashed into a tent. With a roar, he spat out a mouthful of blood and jumped up again. Obviously he was injured. Amon's arrow caught Aluka off guard, causing him to suffer a great deal of damage. Aluka's figure then disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the majestic Metatro standing in the most conspicuous place on the hillside. When Aruka flew out and knocked over the tent, more soldiers rushed out of the camp, forming a formation and running towards the hill. Before they arrived, more than a dozen arrows were shot at Medanzo with a whistling sound. Medanzo did not dodge. Instead, he rushed down the hillside with a long sword in his hand and shouted, "I am Medanzo." When the arrows hit the scorpion shell armor, they all trembled. The black scales on the armor rippled, and the arrows all fell to the ground. The ordinary arrows shot by ordinary warriors were not strong enough to penetrate the protection of the scorpion shell armor. And the impact was also scattered by the defensive effect of Medanzo's magic. In such a daze, he had already rushed down the hillside like an arrow from a bow. It was too late for the guards on the opposite side to shoot their javelins, so they could only raise their weapons and fight in close combat. The guards were horrified. This assassin was absolutely crazy. He dared to attack the king's camp alone. Judging from his momentum, he was definitely a supreme warrior, but no matter how powerful he was, he could not be stronger than the guards of His Majesty the King. Was this an assassination or a death wish? Medanzo did not care so much. He just wanted to make as much noise as possible. The best effect was to attract the supreme mage and another supreme warrior around the king to come out and cover for Amon to launch a surprise attack in the dark. He waved the long-handled heavy sword in his right hand, and the sword had the strange effect of distorting space, scattering cracks, and bursting energy. His left hand pulled out the snake-tooth dagger, and between the slashes, there was a soul-shaking roar of fear. As soon as he rushed into the enemy's formation, Medanzo cut down 7 or 8 guards. He had never been so powerful before. These people were all advanced warriors, and their weapons and armor were quite good. However, the lethality of Madanzo's dagger and the defensive effect of the scorpion shell armor were too good. Not to mention that he was not only a peak 6th level warrior, but also a 6th level mage. Madanzo almost rushed into the camp, but the king's guards were not to be trifled with. After cutting down 7 or 8 people, he shook his right hand and made an earth-shattering noise, knocking away a spear shot from a distance. He took half a step back to parry the cross attacks on his left and right. The supreme warrior Aruka, who had just been knocked away, had already rushed up with a battle axe. Chapter 131. Madanzo and Aruka fought, and the scene immediately became extremely violent. The besieging guards did not even see that Madanzo was only a 6th level warrior. He was not at a disadvantage at all. Aruka was injured. In a hurry, he had to take Amon's powerful arrow. Even now, there was a tearing pain between his chest and ribs. Moreover, Madanzo knew magic and used it very skillfully. Madanzo did not fight like a mage. He waved a heavy sword with a staff as the hilt, and all kinds of strange forces were integrated into the attack range of the sword. He looked like a supreme warrior who had undergone the second awakening of power, but his magic was extremely profound. The place where the two fought seemed to be swept by thunder and wind, accompanied by the thunderous sound of weapons colliding. A surge of surging power surged and flew, and ordinary warriors could hardly get close. After all, the king's guards were well trained. As soon as they saw this scene, they had already formed a formation on both sides. Their shields were connected as one, and they raised their spears, blocking Madanzo's space to dodge left and right. As soon as he showed a flaw, they were ready to stab him like a hedgehog. Aruka was somewhat unable to fight against Madanzo. He tried several times to get rid of the melee between the two, but to no avail. He could only wave his sword and use his powerful strength to resist the entanglement of various magic spells. Madanzo's sword and dagger attacks gave him almost no chance to fight back. Madanzo, who had the upper hand, also frowned secretly. This wounded supreme warrior was still so brave, fighting desperately without retreating. It was impossible to finish him off in a short time. After a brief panic, the surrounding soldiers had already arranged their battle formation, and there were also many guards who had rushed out of the camp. The movement he wanted to make was almost enough. It seemed that he had to be more ruthless. Madanzo put away the dagger in his left hand, and stretched out his hand to take out 2 scrolls. He was still paying attention to the movements in the direction of the camp during the fierce battle. If he threw out the supreme magic scrolls, he did not believe that he would not be able to alarm the supreme mage inside. As soon as he took out the scrolls, he waved his sword and forced Aruka back a few steps. His figure also flashed to the left, stirring up a force to hit the soldiers on one side of the formation. The magic power of the spatial shock should have knocked the soldiers in the front row back a few steps. Unexpectedly, a halo flashed through the soldiers' shields, as if they were connected by an invisible chain. Madanzo was actually shaken back a step. A petite, cloaked person had already walked out of the camp, waved her staff gently, and did not speak, but had quietly cast magic to help the guards fight Madanzo's power. This person had already seen that Aruka was no match for Madanzo after he was injured. It might be possible to stop the assassin with just this supreme warrior and dozens of guards around him, but it would be difficult to take him down. Madanzo also knew that the opponent's supreme mage finally couldn't help but make a move. Looking at this posture, he wanted to capture him alive and interrogate him. His goal had been achieved, and without any hesitation, he waved his hand and unfolded the scrolls. Amon was really willing to spend the capital, and gave Madanzo 2 supreme scrolls, one of which was the Wind Blade Dance, which he had used when he was chased by Julian's men at the Nile River. It was a supreme magic that attacked in a wide area indiscriminately. Suddenly, there was a violent wind around Madanzo, and countless small airflows were condensed and compressed, like messy blades shooting in all directions. The battlefield where Madanzo was located did not have the space to cast this kind of large-scale attack magic. He was fighting with Aruka head-on, and on his left and right were the guards holding shields. He had no time to retreat far enough to control the magic. As expected of a disciple taught by Amon, The method he used was the same as Amon's. The wind blades that erupted attacked him as well. No one expected him to do this. A blue phosphorescence appeared on the scorpion shell armor, which was the result of Madanzo using his magic to maximize the defensive effect of the armor. At the same time, he half knelt on the ground with his sword upside down, and put the end of the sword hilt on his forehead, as if he was praying. Smoke and dust rose to form a hazy shield that surrounded him in the middle, and there were constant flashes of fire in the smoke and dust, which was caused by the friction of the wind blades. Aruka waved his heavy sword wildly and flew backward, the dazzling light of the sword like a shining silver shield in front of him. The supreme mage in the distance also reacted very quickly. With a chant and a wave of his staff, the light and shadow on the shields of the soldiers on both sides twisted, as if a translucent invisible wall had been raised, refracting the flying wind blades. This defensive magic consumed a lot of energy, and the supreme mage did not give Madanzo a chance to break through them one by one. The formation of the guards on the left and right did not move, and it seemed that only Madanzo himself was at a disadvantage. If he did not throw out the other scroll, and if there were no other accidents, when the wind blades dissipated, Madanzo would have been caught. The other scroll that Madanzo threw out was not offensive. It was a large-scale information disruption magic, and the surroundings instantly became dark, as if a thick fog had suddenly burst out and shrouded them. Not only could the naked eye see nothing, even detection magic was disrupted in an instant, and no one knew where he was. As soon as he saw this, the supreme mage realized that Madanzo wanted to escape and immediately shouted, "No one move, hold your positions." With a wave of the staff in his hand, a light fell and dispersed the thick fog in front of Aruka. The light hovered and was about to illuminate the thick fog layer by layer on the battlefield when suddenly there was a sharp and harsh sound from the camp, as if something had been cut in half by a sharper blade. At the same time someone shouted, "There's an assassin!" This shout was accompanied by a muffled thunder-like collision, and stopped abruptly. Then there seemed to be a heavy object flying out with the sound of the wind, smashing many things, and then a cold voice said, "If you want the king's life, don't move, listen to my orders." The voice was not loud, and the speaker was also very young. When he spoke, it must have been accompanied by information transmission magic, and everyone inside and outside the camp could hear it clearly. The supreme mage and Aruka no longer cared about Madanzo, turned around and rushed back to the camp. The gorgeous animal skin tent at the very center of the camp had fallen at this moment, and it looked as if it had been directly cut in half by a huge sharp blade. In the courtyard surrounded by curtains in front of the tent, the large iron stove that had originally been placed there for barbecuing was also knocked away, pulling down the curtains and smashing down the two tents in front of it. When it stopped far away, it had been completely deformed. The person who had knocked away the big iron stove turned out to be a person. He was the supreme warrior Afi, who was the king's bodyguard. At this moment, rust and charcoal dust were on his shoulders, and he was standing at the entrance of the tent with a long sword in his hand, even though the door of the tent was long gone. The courtyard was in a mess, and the front and back of the tent had been split in half. However, everything in the front tent was still intact. The king's throne was upright, and on the table in front of the throne, there was a bedboard that had been split in half. On one side of the bed was a naked beauty. It was the king's beloved concubine. She was trembling in fear as she wrapped herself in a blanket. The king's bodyguards, servants, and two sixth-level mages all stood at the edge of the fallen tent, but no one dared to approach. The king Wuxia was sitting on his throne with a horrified look on his face. His body was still trembling uncontrollably, not knowing whether it was from fear or from the cold. Because His Majesty was also naked, his bare shoulders and thighs were exposed. The man next to him was quite polite. He pulled out half of the bill and tossed it to Wuxia. Wuxia clutched the half of the bed sheet tightly with both hands, as if grasping at a life-saving straw. Standing beside him was a young man wearing the same strange armor as Madanzo, holding a sharp dagger in his right hand against Wuxia's shoulder. The supreme mage accompanying the king, Celia, rushed back. She had already realized that the king had been kidnapped, and her first thought was to use teleportation magic to snatch the king back from the assassin's dagger, but she immediately dismissed the idea. because she saw the assassin holding a gray scroll in his left hand, gently twirling it between his fingers, as if he would open it at any time. Celia was knowledgeable, and she recognized at a glance that it was the legendary Tiamat's wrath. If the kidnapping of the king failed, the assassin trapped in the camp would naturally die, but if he opened the scroll before he died, no one here, including the king and Lucia, would survive. Celia was not sure that she could kill the assassin in one fell swoop before he opened the scroll. This assassin was able to sneak near the king's tent without anyone noticing, and repel the supreme warrior Afi as soon as he made a move. He was definitely more difficult to deal with than the assassin outside. The atmosphere was tense to the extreme, but Celia calmed down instead. She stepped forward with her staff in hand and asked, "Strange warrior, how dare you? Who are you?" The assassin smiled slightly. His smile was very hearty, and his teeth were very white. "You may have heard of my name. My name is Amon, and I am the commander of the Inare Legion of the Empire of Igut. The person outside is my personal guard captain Madanzo. You must also want to ask me why I am doing this, and what conditions will be met in order to release your majesty the king. After hearing my name, I think there is no need to ask these questions anymore. I am here for the peace between the two countries, and I just want to sit down and have a good talk." Even as a supreme mage with deep concentration, Celia almost lost her balance. The assassin turned out to be the commander of the Inare Legion, Amon, a survivor of the Dushians. At this time, the supreme warrior Aruka, who rushed back, shouted, "General Amon, I admire your courage, but do you really think that you can go back alive after coming here alone?" Amon was still smiling. "Of course I want to go back alive. Before I came, I thought about it. His Majesty the King will protect me, right?" This was said to Lucia. The King of Hittite also clearly saw the situation around him. Although the assassin was forcing him with his sword, he was also surrounded. In the hinterland behind the battle lines, if the assassin harmed his life, it would be impossible for him to escape. Lucia also regained a little calmness and said in a dignified tone, "General Amon, I can forgive your betrayal and offense, but since you are here to pray for peace, you should first put down your weapon and ask for my forgiveness." Chapter 132. Amon shook his head and said, "If you want me to put down my weapon here, there is only one possibility. That is, your guards will kill me. But before that, they will definitely kill your majesty by mistake. So in order to protect you, I can't put down my weapon. Before your majesty makes a request, let me make a request first. Invite the person outside in." Under the escort of a team of guards, Madanzo walked in proudly. He held his sword and stood behind Amon. He behaved like a loyal guard captain. Looking at his chest out and his head held high, it was as if he was accompanying the commander to inspect his army, but his eyes kept staring at the two beauties on the bed. He held his sword and whispered in Amon's ear, "My God, you are so amazing. I knew you would definitely catch the king, but I didn't expect you to bring such a beautiful scene to the table." Then he waved his hand and said to the people around him, "You servants, how can you watch the princess's erotic body? You have no manners at all. Quickly cover your faces and leave. His Majesty also needs to wear clothes. It is not suitable to stay here any longer. Get us a good tent. Do you want His Majesty to sleep naked in the open in the middle of the night?" As he spoke, Madanzo had already taken over Amon's position. He hung his sword back at his waist and pulled out his dagger. He gently tapped the back of the chair behind King. Amon put away his dagger and reached out to take a branch out of thin air. He took 2 steps forward and pointed to the surroundings, saying, "I am sorry I have been rude. How can I treat His Majesty and the 2 princesses like this? Please fetch the king's clothes and help the 2 concubines leave this place to have a good rest. Also, help us change into a comfortable tent." He flicked the branch, and the 2 bed boards on the table flew up, as if they were carried by an invisible hand in the air, and landed in the courtyard outside. Only then did Celia see clearly that the branch in Amon's hand was a magic staff. This legion commander also knew magic, and was quite skilled at using magic. The king's personal attendants were very efficient. The palace maids carried the bedboards and the 2 princesses away, and set up a gorgeous tent made of animal skin. Naturally, the king had a special tent and bedding for his travels. Amon and Madanzo guarded Wuxia. They only said that the king was tired and frightened and needed to rest. They would talk tomorrow. Then they closed the tent. The palace guards surrounded the tent. Amon and Madanzo could not escape. However, no one outside dared to rush in because the king's life was in the hands of the assassins. No one knew how the king and the assassins were resting. Anyway, the rest of the people in the camp would not be able to sleep. They could only wait for dawn anxiously, and guess what the two assassins wanted to do? The supreme commander of the camp temporarily became the supreme mage accompanying the king, Celia. She could not make the decision for such a big thing. She immediately sent someone to send a secret report to the legion commander and chief priest of the army of Nanner, as well as the frontline headquarters of the main battlefield. At present, this news could only be known to the top leaders of the frontline. Apart from that, it had to be strictly sealed and could not be leaked. Otherwise, the morale of the army would be shaken. Of course, Celia had to ask the supreme warrior Afi, who was guarding the door of the tent, how could he let the assassins catch the king? Afi also had a belly full of grievances. Madanzo made a lot of noise outside and finally attracted the attention of Celia. When she went out to cast magic in an attempt to capture Madanzo, Amon sneaked into the camp from another direction. If Celia was still next to the king's tent, even if Amon could enter the camp, it would be difficult for him to quietly approach the tent where the king slept. The king's tent had 3 entrances. The front tent was the usual place for meetings and banquets. Afi guarded the front tent with his personal guards. The middle accounting room was the king's bedroom. There was another accounting room at the back, which was guarded by the servants of the king. Outside the back tent, there were 2 mages and a group of guards. When Celia made her move, the fierce battle outside the camp attracted everyone's attention. Amon suddenly made his move on the side of the king's tent. With one move, he split the entire tent in half, but the people inside were unharmed. It was hard to describe how amazing this move was. The dagger Amon used was not made of the snake's fangs, but the dagger given to him by Mayor Dusty when he left Duke a few years ago. Amon snuck in without a sound, but when he attacked he did not hide it at all. It was a knife used by hunters in the mountains, but it shone with a dazzling light, like a rainbow in the night sky. From afar, Amon swung the knife and cut the tent, which was more than 10 feet wide, in half, making a sharp sound. The separated tent was rolled to both sides by a force, covering all the people in front and behind the tent. As a supreme warrior, Afi naturally would not be entangled by the fallen tent. When Amon waved his dagger, he reacted. He opened the tent with his sword and rushed in, appearing next to the king. He was closer to the tent. Although he was delayed, he rushed into the tent faster than Amon. But as soon as he rushed in, Amon, who was also rushing over, raised his staff. The bedboard that the king slept on was split into 2 halves. 2 naked concubines lying on it were thrown towards Afi. Afi's duty was to protect the king and the concubines. He had already raised his sword, but his subconscious reaction was not to slash out. Instead, he used the tip of the sword to pick up the 2 bedboards very delicately, and they fell smoothly on the table in the front tent. The 2 frightened concubines were unharmed. When he raised his sword to attack again, Amon also rushed forward, waving his staff with a whistling sound. This was the power that only a supreme warrior could stimulate. The long sword and the iron staff collided, and the sound was like muffled thunder. It was Afi who flew out. If Afi had blocked the staff with all his strength, he might not have been shaken so far, but the king was lying between the 2 of them. Wuxia deserved to be unlucky today. He had a good time during the day, and he was in a good mood after drinking some wine at night. He was in bed with the 2 concubines in his arms when suddenly there was a sharp whistling sound, and he saw the stars in the sky naked. The king and the beauties were fighting, and the others did not dare to disturb them, so they were not too close to the middle tent. Amon used spatial magic to accurately split the bedboard, and threw the 2 concubines towards the supreme warrior Afi. Wuxia fell to the ground between the 2 cracked bedboards, and then looked up to see a sword and a staff clashing above his body. If the power of the 2 supreme warriors broke out in a head-on collision, the king, who was nearby and had no shelter, would be killed several times by the aftermath of the sword light. So Affy could not take it head-on, so he was knocked out. When he smashed the big iron stove in the courtyard and got up and rushed back, the others had already jumped out from under the tent. Celia and Aruka also arrived, but the king had already fallen into Amon's hands. The commander of the army of Nanner, Oreben, and the chief priest, Vivian, were shocked when they received the news. When they heard that the assassins turned out to be the commander of the Inare Legion, Amon and his guard captain, Madanzo, they suddenly realized when the two men had crossed the line of defense and entered the rear. It was during the inexplicable attack 2 days ago. Goliath had already warned Amon that he was the most familiar with the terrain and environment in this area. But Oreben never dreamed that Amon, as the commander of the Legion, would quietly infiltrate the enemy's line of defense with only one follower, avoiding all the sentries and scouts, and accurately touch the king's camp. Then he successfully took the king hostage. If anything happened to the king here, not only would the accompanying guards not be able to escape the blame, but Oreben and Vivian would also have to bear the consequences. Even if they achieved a great victory on the battlefield, they could not make up for such a mistake. Moreover, the army of Nanner did not win the battle at all. After receiving the secret report, Oreben immediately ordered the entire army to defend the camp and the line of defense. They were not allowed to take the initiative to attack. He and Vivian took the elite guards and rushed to the king's camp on horseback. In truth, the king's guards were more than enough to deal with the two assassins. No matter how many people they sent, it would be pointless. However, Orben had no choice but to do so. He had to act like a loyal protector. On the side of the Inare Legion, the chief priest George was anxiously waiting for news. The fate of Amon and Madanzo was unknown. They would decide the fate of the entire war. Amon had set his plan. Even if he could not capture the king Hittite, he could still disrupt the enemy's battle arrangement and disturb the army of Nanner in the rear. Only then would the Inare Legion have the opportunity to carry out Pharaoh's order to rescue the main battlefield. The risk of 2 people was better than the death of 20,000 people. Amon gave the order as the commander of the legion, and did not bring a priest with him. The chief priest, George, had the responsibility of supervising the army, but in the end he reluctantly nodded and did not stop Amon's action. Oreben and Vivian suddenly left the camp with the elite guards, and rushed to the edge of the charcoal marsh in the northeast. Naturally, they did not hide from George's investigation. The supreme mage could not help but be secretly delighted. It seemed that Amon's action had succeeded. At the same time, he was also very worried. He did not know the situation of Amon and Madanzo. It was almost impossible for them to escape. The only help that George could provide was to exert pressure on the battlefield, and the Inare Legion had long been ready to attack. George and John immediately led the main force of the Legion to the north to attack the camp of the army of Nanner. If it had been a few days ago, the Inare Legion would never have taken such a military action, but now the situation had changed. In the last battle of pursuit and attack on the camp, the army of Nanner had underestimated the enemy and attacked too fiercely. The battle was not successful and their morale was damaged. They had not yet rested, not to mention that the commander was not there. The order they received was to defend to the death. The Inare Legion had just won 3 battles and their morale was high. The confidence of the soldiers who had never fought a war before had reversed. No matter what kind of enemy they encountered, they would dare to fight, let alone take the initiative to attack the defeated. The Inare Legion sent out all the elites and launched a fierce attack on the army of Nanner. This time it was really equivalent to tying people to a tree and beating them. George did not attack rashly, but set up a battle formation, chose a main direction of attack, and steadily advanced step by step. Since the other party did not take the initiative to attack, this fierce battle scene looked like a drill to attack a camp. John calmly mobilized the various troops to cooperate and launched round after round of attacks. Just when Oreben was halfway there, he heard that the camp was under attack. He was in a dilemma, so he gritted his teeth and continued to march to the king's camp. He sent someone to pass on the message that they must rely on the fortifications to defend to the death. George's purpose was not to attack the camp, but to use the strategic advantage to severely damage the enemy's strength. Therefore, he did not attack the fortress and the strong fortifications. He only chose to attack the weak links on the defense line. The army of Nanner had paid a lot of casualties in order to defend the gap in the defense line. The battle lasted for a day. The NRA Legion, who was the main attacker, had also suffered hundreds of casualties. However, they managed to attack a corner of the army of Nanner's camp and achieved a brilliant result. They burned a lot of tents and a lot of military supplies. Before Orben and Saya's backup troops arrived to reinforce them, they withdrew their troops and returned to the camp. At the same time, they brought back a lot of spoils of war. After this battle, on this flank battlefield, the combat effectiveness, morale, and initiative of attack and defense between the two armies had been reversed. After suffering 2 heavy losses, the army of Nanner was no longer able to take the initiative to fight back against the NRA Legion. They could only passively adopt a defensive position. There was another rumor that made the Hittite soldiers shudder. The NRA Legion shouted a slogan when they attacked. "The king of Hittite has been captured alive by our great legion commander, Amon. The Hittite army is about to be defeated. Your legion commander has already rushed to the king to surrender. Why don't you surrender now?" Such a rumor was unbelievable, but they had to be suspicious. The legion commander and the chief priest left in a hurry, and only ordered to defend to the death. The battle was so fierce, but they did not come back to preside over the overall situation. Something big must have happened. Was the king really captured alive? If the king was captured by the enemy, then the main force of the Hittite army must have been defeated. A day later, Orben returned and immediately ordered severe punishment for those who spread the rumor in the army, but panic shrouded the hearts of many soldiers like a lingering shadow, but they did not dare to speak out publicly. Why did Orben come back? He was under the orders of Juguli, the prime minister of the empire and the minister in charge of military affairs, and Goliath, the commander-in-chief of the front line. Half a day after he arrived at the king's camp, Goliath personally drove a shuttle and arrived with Lord Juguli. Goliath received the news that the king had been kidnapped very suddenly. Before the news came, he was discussing the front line with Prince Asher, who was supervising the battle on behalf of the king, Juguli, the prime minister of the kingdom who was commanding the Enlil Legion, the chief priest of the Enlil Legion, Walter, the chief priest of the Legion of Anu, and others. Janbia was an elder of the Hittite Academy of Magic, the chief mage of the palace, and also a 9th-level supreme mage. There were only 3 9th-level supreme mages in the Hittite kingdom, and 2 of them had come to the front line this time. It could be said that all the elites had come. Janbia frowned and said, "His Majesty the King's latest order is to urge us to launch the main attack and destroy the main force of the Igut army as soon as possible. It would be best if we can capture Lazith II alive, and establish an unprecedented achievement in the history of Hittite. Lord Goliath, you as the commander-in-chief of the front line, have been holding back for so long, and His Majesty the King is very anxious." Goliath smiled bitterly. "Of course I understand His Majesty the King's feelings. Everyone wants to achieve the final victory as soon as possible, but if we launch the main attack now, the Igut army will be fighting like a cornered beast, and their fighting power and despair cannot be underestimated. Although we can achieve victory, the price will be great. As long as we are besieged for another half a month, the Hittite army will win without a fight, and they will neither have the strength to counterattack, nor will they be able to retreat through the desert." Prince Asher nodded. Lord Goliath's command of this war is simply divine. The Igut army has been led by the nose by us, and the development of the war to this point is completely in line with our original expectations. His Majesty the King is indeed a little too impatient. He has waited for many years for this great victory, and of course he wants to capture Lazith too. The pharaohs of Igut have become the prisoners of the king of Hittite, and they will be able to wash away the shame of 100 years. I will send an envoy to explain the specific situation of the battlefield to His Majesty the King, and all of you should act according to plan." Goliath added with a smile, "I suggest that Your Highness add another explanation. If you want to capture Pharaoh alive, he will definitely escape when the main attack is launched. Although the experts around him cannot lead the army to retreat, they can protect one person to escape back to the Igut army. The reason why Pharaoh has not left yet is because the main force of the army is trapped in the desert, and he is waiting for the arrival of reinforcements. Juguli also analyzed. I hope that Pharaoh escapes as soon as possible, which means that he has given up on the war, and the army that is besieged by us will collapse without a fight, and victory will come sooner. Pharaoh staying in the army is a symbol that the Igut army will continue to send reinforcements here. The reinforcements may come from two directions. One is the reinforcements from the Cape States, and the other is the Nra Legion from the coastline. Prince Ashur nodded. The strength of the Igut Empire is strong, and in order to turn the tide of the war, it is entirely possible to invest another 2 legions. Walter interjected cautiously. In my opinion, the longer Pharaoh does not escape, and the longer the war is delayed, the better it is for Hittite. If Pharaoh leaves, and we destroy the Horus Legion and the Legion of Isis, although we can inflict heavy damage to Igut and achieve a temporary victory, it will not shake the foundation of the Igut Empire. With Lazathi's temper, he will definitely reorganize his army and make a comeback. Even if it is not for the sake of conquering the fertile land, it will be for the dignity of the Empire of Igut in his face. In that case, the war will not end, and regardless of whether we win or lose in the future, we will have to pay a heavy price. If we surround the Empire of Igut and do not attack now, we will attract the reinforcements of the Empire of Igut to fight under unfavorable conditions, trap the main force of Pharaoh, and only attack his reinforcements, and destroy them all in the desert. This will cause the Empire of Igut to be unable to launch an expedition for a long time, and peace will truly come. Chapter 133. Let's play another game of chess. Juguli continued. The main forces of Pharaoh and Igut are here, and they are a pawn to attract reinforcements. Our battle plan is to eliminate these reinforcements step by step. When the reinforcements are eliminated one after another, Pharaoh's army will finally be unable to hold on, and it will be too late for Lazith II to escape. We can concentrate all our experts to stop him, and even if we can't capture him alive, we can kill him on his escape route. In short, we can't let this man go. Goliath stroked the back of his chair and said, "This is the right way to use troops, and it is also the best result. The first to be eliminated should be the Nra Legion, which is a very weak miscellaneous army, but for some reason, I am a little worried. Although their leader is young and this is his first time leading an army, his experience is full of twists and turns, and he might do something. I have reminded the army of Nanner to be more vigilant, but I am still a little worried." Prince Ashur laughed. Lord Goliath need not worry too much. That man is just a young supreme warrior. No matter how capable he is, how can he command a miscellaneous army to change the whole situation? The army of Nanner can keep a close eye on him. We have intercepted several messengers sent by Pharaoh, and have received accurate news that the Nra Legion will have to leave the coastline and march into the desert alone to die. Haven't we already prepared for this? Just then, a secret report sent by Celia arrived. It was a 6th-level mage who had arrived overnight on a shuttle. When everyone heard that the king was being held hostage by Ammon, they all jumped up in surprise. It was really a bolt from the blue. If they were to talk about the war, if they let Ammon kill the king, the Hittite army would still act according to the battle plan they had just formulated, and they would still win. At worst, they could just replace the king with a new one. But no one could say such a thing, let alone do such a thing. On the other hand, the wavering of the morale of the army was immeasurable. The situation of the battle might have unexpected changes. The first thing to consider was how to rescue the king. After an emergency discussion, the lords decided to let Prince Ashur stay in the army to temporarily command the overall situation, while Goliath personally drove the shuttle to the king's camp with the prime minister. Goliath did not bring a single guard with him. The supreme mage saw the situation very clearly. There were only 2 assassins, and they were relying on the king in their hands. No matter how many people went, it would be useless. Not to mention that Goliath himself was already one of the best masters in the Hittite kingdom. The other party must have captured the king to ask for peace talks. Those present should be important ministers of the Hittite kingdom who kept their word. Only then would they be able to decide many things on the spot. Madanzo and I held the king hostage and rested in the tent. There was no movement throughout the night. The next morning, the sun shone brightly, the air in the wilderness was very fresh, and the clear and melodious chirping of birds could be heard in the jungle. A few years ago, this place was still a desolate desert, and there were no birds chirping. After the flood, too many changes had indeed taken place. Celia used detection magic to scan the movements in the tent. The king and the two assassins had always been there, but then her detection magic encountered another disturbance. The other party seemed to be using magic to detect the surroundings, but did not reject her snooping. "Warriors, we have brought breakfast to His Majesty the King. You also need to eat, please open the tent." Taking the opportunity to deliver breakfast, Celia finally decided to enter the tent to see the situation. At least to make sure that His Majesty the King was safe and sound. "There's no need for breakfast. We are here as guests, so we can't neglect the host. We are preparing to serve His Majesty the King. If you want to see the king, then come in." Ah's voice came from the tent, and the heavy curtains of the front tent rolled upward without any wind. The lineup of food delivery was really strong. Celia held a staff in her hand, and a tray floated in front of her. Aruka and Afi, the two supreme warriors, carried weapons on their waists, and each held a tray of food. They followed into the front tent. Then everyone's eyes widened, as if they had seen something even more incredible than the king being kidnapped. There were 3 people in the front tent. I was standing by the table, boiling soup in a utensil that no one knew where he got it from. No wonder when the tent curtain was lifted, she smelled a fragrant aroma. There were also a few pieces of baked bread beside his hand. The king sat on the seat opposite Ah, and in front of him was an empty plate and a glass of wine. The wine had a light rose smell, and was very mellow. It was obviously a rare good wine. Madanzo stood beside the king, holding a sharp dagger as if he was trimming his nails. The tip of the dagger was pointed at the side of the king's neck, and with detection magic, there was a burst of roaring coming from the dagger, with a shocking power that struck the mind. In the middle of the table, there was a magic artifact. The base seemed to be made of gold, and it was engraved with strange patterns. It looked like a lamp, and the parangan at the wick seemed to be emitting an invisible light. This was the shadow-chasing lamp, and it was currently placed in the eye of a divine formation. Looking at the 4 corners of the tent, there were actually several Taraculus and Ventisalamus placed in order, forming a very intricate divine formation. It could detect all sorts of movements inside and outside the tent at any time. If one were to use their magic power to activate it, its detection range could completely envelop the entire camp and the sky above. What was seen in the front tent was only a corner of this magic formation. In fact, I used the 3 spaces in the front and back of the tent to form a magic formation, using 12 Taraculus and Ventisalamus respectively. Not to mention how amazing the effect of this magic formation was, just the value of the artifact used was shocking. Celia originally wanted to find an opening to rescue the king. What she was afraid of was the Tiamat's wrath in Ah's hand. But at this moment, seeing this magic formation and the dagger in Madanzo's hand, the Supreme Mage realized that even without the Tiamat's wrath, she would not be able to rescue the king safely from the hands of the assassins. This magic formation was in a constant state of alertness. As long as there was any movement in the surroundings, the shadow-chasing lamp would immediately react. There was also something else that was slightly surprising. To maintain the operation of this magic circle, it did not require a lot of magic power. However, to monitor the surroundings day and night, it would consume a lot of magic power. Ordinary mages might not be able to bear it. And now, it was obviously Madanzo who was operating the magic formation. It seemed that both of them were proficient in magic and had a continuous supply of magic power, so they did not care about the magic formation. But compared to the other matter in the tent, this magic formation was nothing. Ah and Madanzo did not forget their etiquette. The king sat while they stood, one making breakfast, the other standing at the side like a guard. But the king did not sit in the middle of the table. Instead, he sat on the left side of the table, where the ministers usually sat during meals. On the throne in the middle of the table, there was actually a cat squatting. Of course, a cat was not as tall as a human. I was really careful and considerate. He found something to pad the chair so that the seat was level with the table, so that the cat could squat on it and reach the things in front of it. In front of it was a bowl of soup, a few fragrant roasted paws, and a whole bottle of wine next to the cat. The cat was holding the bottle to its mouth and drinking happily. I invited the king to have breakfast, and the first food that he made was given to a cat to eat first, and the cat sat in the middle, while the empty plate in front of the king was left to the side. Looking at us in different expression, I seemed to think that this was reasonable, and the cat accepted it calmly. Celia was so angry that her face changed. The plate floating in the air fell on the table. She pointed her staff at I and said, "How can you be so rude? Where did this cat come from? You actually dare to let it sit on His Majesty's seat?" Schrodinger's paw released the bottle of wine and raised his head to look at Celia. His expression was like that of a person, calm with a sneer. He then glanced at King Hittite and lowered his head to continue drinking the soup, not even making a sound. Atienne bowed and explained politely, "This is my cat called Schrodinger. It sneaked in last night. I hope it did not disturb your rest. It is already used to this. Can't you see that I am also standing at the side? I have not done anything disrespectful to His Majesty the King. I am personally making breakfast." When Ah Gang first came into contact with Schrodinger, he only felt that the cat was arrogant. But as time went on, he found it more and more interesting. In fact, the cat did not change at all. It was only the person beside the cat that changed. Therefore, he felt that it was even more inconceivable. When Ah Gang was just a noble miner, this cat that could write sacred texts was very good, and there was nothing wrong with it. But when Ah Gang became a great warrior and great magician, and rose to the top ranks of the continent's strongest, Schrodinger was still very good. When Ah Gang became the commander of the Empire of Igut, even when he was commanding thousands of troops, Schrodinger was still very good. Now Hittite King was sitting at the side, and Schrodinger was still high and mighty. Seeing that Celia was pointing her staff at Madanzo without saying a word, but had already pressed the tip of her sword to the back of Lucier King's ear, Celia took a step back and shouted with a red face, "This is a humiliation. I cannot accept it. Don't think that you can do whatever you want just because you are holding the king hostage. No matter how this matter is resolved, I will make a human request, and I will duel with you." Usually, duels were the result of noble warriors who had nothing better to do and had nothing better to do. Who would have thought that this supreme mage would also make such a request to Ah Gang after being angered? Ah Gang asked while boiling soup, "How do you want to duel?" "Celia. A human duel between the two of us. I can't forget the humiliation you brought me today. You held the king hostage in front of me, and you even made His Majesty the King give a cat to accompany him. After this war is over, I will summon my spiritual beast, and you will bring this cat. We will have a real duel. My name is Celia, a noble of the Hittite royal family and a supreme mage." Ah Gang raised his head and said, "My name is Ah Gang, the son of a miner in the town of Duk, and I am currently the commander of the Empire of Igut. I accept your request for a duel, but that will have to wait until after the war is over, if we are both still alive. Dear Supreme Mage Celia, I know you are not satisfied. I used a trick to hold the king hostage, and you want a head-on duel to wash away your humiliation. I have no reason not to agree. To tell you the truth, I admire you very much. There are not many women who can become mages, and you are only the second supreme mage I have seen. It was too dark last night, and Celia had been wearing a cloak the whole time. It was only now that Ah Gang saw the supreme mage clearly. She was actually very beautiful. After taking off the cloak, the skin of her face and hands was as white as cow's milk, like snow under the sun, not tanning no matter how much the sun shone on her. He was a mighty supreme mage with a cute baby face. His chin was slightly pointed, his face was a little round, his eyes were big, his eyelashes were long, and his long hair was combed into bangs. When she was angry, her big eyes widened even more, her fair face turned pink, and her chest heaved up and down. She didn't look fierce at all. If anyone was deceived by her appearance, they would be in trouble. She was a real supreme mage. And Madanzo had already experienced her power yesterday. Celia put down her staff and replied in a deep voice. Well, Commander Agang, I hope you will remember today's agreement, if we are still alive when the war is over. The soup was ready, and Agang personally filled a large bowl, walked around the table to the other side of the king, handed it over with both hands, and said respectfully, Your Majesty, please have breakfast. For the sake of safety, we will only use the food and water we brought, and you will do the same. Then he turned to Celia and the other two warriors and said, You haven't eaten yet, right? Since you brought the food, let's eat together. Did not eat the food they brought, nor did he let the king eat, which made Celia and the two supreme warriors a little embarrassed. Agang did not forget his etiquette. He stood there and served the king first, and then made food for himself, while Madanzo guarded by the side. King Lucier had calmed down at this moment. Since he had fallen into Os hands, he did not want to lose his dignity for no reason. He waved his hand and said, My supreme mage and the two supreme warriors, sit down and eat with us. The king's words were an excuse. Celia and the two supreme warriors thanked him and found a seat at the table. The taste of this meal was really too indescribable, and no one could tell what they had eaten. After breakfast, the king coughed and asked, Agang, I admire your courage. If you were a warrior of the Hittite kingdom, I would definitely reward you heavily for your behavior. You came all the way to the enemy's territory to see me. Can you tell me your purpose now? Agang asked in reply, I have already said that I came for peace. I would like to ask your Majesty, what do you want to achieve in this war, and what is the Hittite kingdom fighting for? Celia replied, It was the empire of Igut that provoked this war first, and we are just defending ourselves. The purpose of this war is, of course, to defeat the powerful enemy, so that they will never dare to invade Hittite, so that the Hittite kingdom will be free from the fate of being a vassal, and wash away the humiliation of 100 years. Lucier nodded and said, We have received the guidance of the oracle and have already won. It is meaningless for you to hold me hostage. Even if you kill me and bury yourself, it will not change the outcome of the war. Agang frowned slightly and suddenly asked, Is it the oracle of Enril? Does it also say that all the temples of Horus in Hittite are to be demolished? Lucier replied, That's right. The temples built by the various cities of Hittite for the king of Igut, Horus, is a symbol of submission. Of course, they have to be demolished. Agang lowered his head and began to count his fingers, saying, First, the empire of Igut must promise not to invade Hittite again. Second, the Hittite kingdom must no longer pay tribute to Igut. Third, all the temples of Horus in Hittite must be demolished, and no longer accept the imposed faith. This is actually an extension of the second point. If you achieve these goals, can you sit down and negotiate? Lucier glanced at Madanzo, who was holding a sharp sword beside him, coughed lightly, and said in a dignified tone, If these three goals can be achieved, it means that Hittite is victorious, and there is no need for the soldiers to bleed anymore. Why can't we negotiate? But you kidnapped me and made me put forward the conditions. With your identity as a commander, can you meet these requirements of Hittite? I replied, I am not here to assassinate, and I do not want to die. I am here for the sake of everyone on both sides. If the Empire of Igut agrees to these conditions, and both sides swear in front of their respective gods, then this matter can be resolved. Naturally, I will not hurt His Majesty the King. Celia sneered and said, Can you make Pharaoh agree to these conditions by talking empty words here? I laughed. I am also clear about the situation on the battlefield. Does Pharaoh have any other choice? Moreover, the people who have the final say in both countries are at the front lines at this moment. If they want to talk, they can talk at any time. Great Mage Celia, you must have sent someone to inform the front lines. When the time comes, we will discuss it here. When there is a result, I will send someone to send a letter to Pharaoh. Celia asked again, What if Igut refuses? If that is the case, I will release His Majesty the King and ask His Majesty the King to forgive me for today's offense, and let me return to the NRA Legion to continue fighting on the battlefield. But if Igut agrees to these conditions, then please end this war and sign a peace treaty between the two countries. His Majesty the King needs to be alone to think about it. Please leave after you have finished eating. The discussion at breakfast was just a test. No matter what the decision was, it could not be made by the king and the few guards around him. Even if the king reluctantly gave an order in this situation, the army at the front lines might not be able to carry it out. There were 3 meals a day. Even if I could choose not to eat, the king could not go hungry. At lunchtime, the commander of the army of Nanner, Orben, and the chief priest Vivian arrived. I opened the large tent and invited everyone to come in to eat with the king, so that they could see that the king was still safe. The scene at noon was finally not so awkward. Because Schrödinger only ate 1 meal a day and did not attend the lunch, the king sat in his own seat. I cooked the meal himself and invited the king to eat first. Even the water he drank was taken from his spatial artifact. Orben was also a supreme warrior, and Vivian was of course a supreme mage. This table did not count but there were 3 supreme warriors and 2 supreme mages sitting at it. When Orben saw that A's eyes were almost spitting fire, he put his hand on the hilt of his sword and shouted, "You are How can you act like a noble supreme warrior by using such despicable means? We should fight bravely on the battlefield, not use such methods to cover up your fear and weakness." Madanzo sneered. "Fear and weakness? Are you saying that we are not brave and strong enough? Then Lord Head, why don't you try to kidnap the pharaohs of Igut?" This sentence made Orben choke for a long time. A waved his hand and said, "Commander of the army of Nanner, I did not expect to meet you here. I don't know if I should say hello to you. I think our army has been tested, and now we are in front of His Majesty the King. Sit down and have a good meal, don't be rude." The lunch was very quiet. During the meal, the old topic was brought up again. I still advised Hittite to negotiate peace, to get Igut to agree to the 3 conditions and withdraw his army. Both sides would then end the war. Orben and Vivian could not make the decision. The king did not express an affirmative opinion. He could not make any decisions under such circumstances. When Vivian came, he also had the intention to rescue the king. But after studying the situation in the big tent, especially after seeing the magic array set up by Abu and communicating with Celia for a long time, he was not sure that he could safely rescue the king from A's hands. He could only continue to wait. It was like looking forward to the stars and the moon. At dinner time, Gallier and Juguli, the commander-in-chief of the battlefield and the prime minister of the kingdom, finally arrived. This dinner was the main course and highlight of the day. The moment Goliath arrived, he immediately requested to see the king. After obtaining the king's approval, he immediately ordered Orben and Vivian to return to the main camp. They should not neglect the war at the front. Goliath understood the situation. It was impossible to rescue the king directly from A. Even without Tiamat's wrath, A would definitely be able to kill the king before he was defeated. If he only wanted to defeat Goliath, he could do it alone. But now that he was holding back, no matter how many experts he sent, it would be useless. During dinner, the king sat in the main seat. Madanzo stood beside the king with his sword in hand, like a loyal guard. The lamp on the table emitted a soft light that illuminated the whole big tent. A sat on the left side, while Juguli and Goliath sat opposite him. The scene looked like the king and a group of ministers were having a discussion overnight. After understanding the situation, Goliath stroked his beard and asked with a smile, "I admire your actions, but why do you think that we must accept your proposal? Child, have you ever thought of another possibility? That you can't escape from here. If you continue like this, when the Igut army is annihilated, the Hittite kingdom will still be able to achieve its goal. Think about your fate. You can't hold the king hostage forever, and you can't trap yourself here forever." I replied with a smile, "I have thought of this possibility, but I'm just trying my best to try. Esteemed Supreme Mage, may I invite you to play another game of chess? The chessboard and chess pieces are ready." Chapter 134. Leave a seat empty. The first chess piece that I moved was the Inara legion that he himself led to attack the army of Nanner's camp in the north of Hittite. He said calmly, "This afternoon, the army of Nanner's commander has arrived. I believe Sir Goliath has already met him. This battle is over. I have not lost in this flank battle. I can still launch an attack at any time. Goliath nodded. I admire you for being able to train a miscellaneous army to what it is today. The army of Nanner is indeed losing the upper hand. As he said this, he moved the army of Nanner's camp back a step and smiled. Then I will let you take the first step. I pointed to the sand table. In this case, I can seize the water source. The logistical supply pressure will be greatly reduced. Goliath still nodded. Yes, you can let your army last longer, but in the long run, you will not be able to win. The army of Nanner relies on SYH. It is very convenient to replenish soldiers and logistical supplies. The NRA Legion is far away from the mainland. Even if you can win the battle, once the main battlefield is defeated, the Hittite army will outflank the NRA Legion. Aside, the main battlefield will still decide the situation. The Cape States will not rescue the pharaoh, and you will stop them in the middle of the desert. He moved another chess piece from the Cape States and placed it in the middle of the desert. Goliath, you can see it very clearly. The purpose of our battle is to defeat all the reinforcements and let the pharaoh army be defeated without a fight. How are you going to fight this battle? I did not speak. He moved 2 chess pieces directly from the Nile River in Igat's territory. They crossed the sea and attacked the hinterland of the Hittite kingdom. After landing, they went straight to the capital. He then explained, with the national strength of the Empire of Igat, it can mobilize at least 2 more expeditionary armies. This time, the pharaoh did not use the navy. If we give up the battlefield here and attack directly from the sea, will you be able to return in time? The army of Nanner that was originally stationed at the coast has been targeted. The Enlil Legion and the Legion of Anu on the main battlefield are too far away. Goliath frowned. Why fight like this? The pharaoh army's goal is thousands of miles of fertile land around the former town of Duk. If we directly cross the sea to attack the capital of Hittite, the losses will be great. Although the king's capital has no military strength, it is still possible to mobilize 2 garrison legions. Relying on the city, we can completely defend it. To be honest, if the Empire of Igat Empire crosses the sea and attacks the capital, you will be able to retreat. His army will be able to the capital. His Majesty will. King will. Army will. Dynasty Igat will. The king. Kingdom will empire. Well. To be honest, if Igat crosses the sea and attacks now, you will have to retreat. Even His Majesty will not bet on the king's capital. Goliath narrowed his eyes. This is just an assumption. No matter what, both sides will suffer. No one can be the winner. Army sighed again. There are many things in the world that people know are unwise, but people will still do them. Who says there is no winner? Take a closer look. He moved 2 more chess pieces. They were from the kingdom of Assyria and the kingdom of Babylon. They bypassed the plateau from the north and crossed the desert from the south. Goliath frowned. These 2 chess pieces are not under your command. Ai smiled. The entire Egyptian army is not under my command, but the ones who can be used in this game are my chess pieces. If the pharaoh died, Egypt would definitely seek revenge. If the pharaoh escaped back to Egypt, with his temper, he would definitely seek revenge. The best choice was to cross the sea and attack. No matter what the outcome of this battle is, Hittite will suffer a great loss, and Igat will not be able to launch an expedition in a short period of time. Thousands of miles of fertile land will appear here. Do you think Assyria or Babylon will not participate? Goliath sighed. Both have the guidance of the gods. No one will give up. However, the way the war is progressing is only your personal deduction, army commander. In reality, it would never have developed to this stage. If I heard that the Empire of Igat's warships are going out to sea, I would immediately order a retreat. I cannot risk the fate of the entire kingdom, let alone the lives of tens of thousands of people. It is a pity that you are not the pharaohs of Igat, Lazith II. Juguli, the prime minister of the kingdom, also understood the situation. He suddenly said, "There is another way to play this game. Let everything on the sand table not happen." The supreme mage Celia asked curiously, "My lord prime minister, what do you want to do?" Juguli glanced at Goliath, but did not speak. Goliath was also silent. Army of God smiled and explained to Celia. My Lord Prime Minister's method is very simple. Kill me. Then he looked around the table and said, killing me is simple. Just mobilize a large number of troops to besiege this tent. My lords can hide far away and not be affected. But there are two things to consider. First, even if I die, Lazith II or the next pharaoh of Igut may still do as I said. Second, if I die, how long can you keep the news of the king's death under wraps? And which prince do you intend to support to succeed the throne? The faces of everyone present, including Wuxia, darkened. The king's gaze towards the prime minister became incomparably gloomy. Juguli hurriedly bowed and explained, Your Majesty King, that is not what I meant. The king's tone was low, but there was no obvious anger. My Lord Prime Minister, I know that you are loyal to the kingdom. We are only discussing various hypotheses here. If you have anything to say, you can say it. I am the king, and if necessary, I will sacrifice myself for the kingdom. Please continue. The prime minister nodded to the king in gratitude, then continued. I cannot guarantee my own survival, but since I am here, I am not afraid of death. If the king of Hittite dies here, what will the consequences be? Madanzo, tell me about it. Madanzo finally found a chance to speak. He held the dagger in his hand and said, If the news is kept under wraps, not only will the morale of the army waver, but the Hittite army will also emerge victorious. But as far as I know, His Majesty the King has not appointed a successor. This time he brought Prince Ashur with him, and the Prime Minister is also in the army. As for the capital, he left your eldest son, Anis, to oversee the country, and the Minister of the Interior to assist him. These two princes should be His Majesty the King's favorite sons, and he is hesitant about who will inherit the throne. Both of them have ambitions for the throne, and they have the support of various factions around them. If His Majesty the King was still around, there would naturally be no problems. But if he suddenly died here, the situation would become complicated. Prince Ashur controls the army, and as long as the people around him support him to ascend to the throne, they will all be rewarded. But Prince Anis has the advantage of staying behind in the capital, and he can accuse Prince Ashur of regicide and succeed the throne on his own with the support of his ministers. There is no need for foreign enemies to attack. The Hittite kingdom has its own internal affairs. I am a straightforward person, and I will say whatever comes to my mind. Your Majesty the King, please do not blame me. Before coming, the Supreme Mage George had analyzed the situation in the Hittite kingdom, and it was indeed facing a struggle for the throne. In particular, one prince was leading the army outside, while the other was supervising the country in the capital. Once the king died and there was no official designation of a successor, the possibility of such an internal affair happening was very high. Metatro applied what he had learned on the spot, and said this prediction in front of everyone. Goliath and the other ministers did not dare to speak. Although the issue of the succession of the two princes was an open secret, everyone would only discuss it in private. Otherwise, it would cause unexpected trouble. The only one who could speak was the king himself. Wuxia said slowly with an inexplicable sense of exhaustion. In fact, Lazith too is in the same trouble. If he dies during the expedition, the Empire of Igut will also have a struggle for the throne, and I'm afraid it will take some time. Anis smiled and said, That is true, but your Majesty should think about yourself first. You are a noble king. There is no need for you to be buried with me. The king finally looked up and asked, My lords, if Igut agrees to all our conditions, and the Hittite kingdom wins without a fight, what conditions will they propose? Goliath and Juguli looked at each other and replied, That will have to be asked by Pharaoh and the ministers around him. I'm afraid Commander Anis cannot make the decision. Anis thought for a moment and said, I have a suggestion. The two countries should sign a peace treaty of non-aggression. The specific content can be discussed, and an oath must be made before their respective gods. Knowing Lazith II's temper, he may still be delusional. I will send an envoy to deliver the news. If there is no reply, perhaps there will be a battle before we can sit down and discuss. Wuxia asked, Lord Prime Minister, Commander Goliath, do you agree? Goliath let out a long sigh. Then let Aeneas send an envoy to give it a try. But who can you send? Aeneas smiled and pointed to Madanzo. I only have this personal guard captain with me. I will first send him to the Inare Legion to inform them of the news here, and then rush to Pharaoh's camp to explain the situation. I'm afraid I will need you to send someone to escort him, the faster the better. Goliath thought for a moment. I suggest that Celia control the shuttle, accompanied by Aruka for protection, carrying the king's orders to escort this warrior at the fastest speed. Lucier nodded and said, Very well, I will give the order now, and wait for the pharaohs of Igat's reply. Madanzo had reached the pinnacle of glory in his life. He rode the shuttle back to the Inare Legion's camp, escorted by the supreme mages and warriors accompanying the king of Hittite. When the soldiers received the news that the king of Hittite had been captured by Aeneas, cheers rang through the sky. When they set off from here to the pharaoh's camp, the chief priest George also controlled another shuttle to follow, bringing as many supplies as he could in his spatial artifact. Although it was a drop in the bucket for the army, it was better than nothing. He had to take this opportunity to explain to Pharaoh why he did not immediately break camp and advance east as ordered, because the Inare Legion was at war with the army of Nannar, and the main force of Hittite in the desert had already set up a line of defense. Aeneas took the risk alone to establish a miraculous achievement, holding the king of Hittite hostage, and forcing the Hittite army to take the initiative to negotiate. When Lazith II received the news from Madanzo, he was ecstatic at first, and rewarded the messenger and George handsomely. Then he was dissatisfied and asked Madanzo in return, why didn't Aeneas force the king of Hittite to surrender? There was no need for Madanzo to explain anything. The ministers around Pharaoh had already persuaded His Majesty not to think this way. The Hittite army had the upper hand, and it was impossible for them to give up the fate of the entire kingdom for the sake of a king. If Lucier would rather die than surrender, there was nothing Aeneas could do. What's more, the army was outside, and it was doubtful whether the order given by a hostage king could be carried out. Lazith II was still a little unwilling. He had already captured the king of Hittite, and yet he still had to agree to the harsh conditions proposed by the other party. How could he be convinced? He told Madanzo to return and agree to withdraw the army, but Hittite still had to submit to the empire of Igat, and there would be no more war between the two countries, and the relationship before the war would be restored. Of course, Lucier and Goliath could not agree to such conditions, so Aeneas sent Madanzo back to convey the attitude of the Hittite side, that the three conditions proposed could not be changed, and that if they wanted to talk, they should talk about other things. It was true that when Pharaoh opened his mouth, Madanzo had to travel back and forth several times in a few days. Fortunately, there was a supreme mage driving the shuttle, or he would have died of exhaustion. It was not easy to be a hero. The reason why Pharaoh was hesitant was that he still had hope for the situation of the army, and hoped that the reinforcements from the Cape States would arrive as soon as possible. While Madanzo was flying back and forth, another battle broke out in the desert. The reinforcements from the Cape States were defeated, and they could not cross the line of the Hittite army to join up with Pharaoh. The Igat army was facing the situation of running out of food and water, and even their arrows were running low. Pharaoh finally decided to bow his head. At the same time, there were several other things that worried Hittite, and they decided to negotiate peace as soon as possible. According to the secret reports, the kingdom of Babylon was gathering troops in the city of Uruk. The Uruk Legion led by Gilgamesh seemed to be on the move, but it was unknown what their target was. Babylon was a coalition of city-states, and all the legions were named after the city-states. Among them, the Uruk Legion led by Gilgamesh and Enkidu was the strongest. On the other hand, Igat had also gathered two legions. The Geb Legion was already on its way to the Cape States, and the Osiris Legion was a navy legion that had appeared at the mouth of the Nile River. Although these two legions could not make it in time to reinforce Pharaoh's army, Hittite would have to pay a huge price if they were to join the battle. The Geb Legion and the Osiris Legion were originally the main forces defending the northern border and southern coast of the empire. This time, half of their troops were left behind, and the other half were replenished from the garrisons of the various city-states. This was a little different from the chess game that I played in the sandbox. The follow-up army of Igut had assumed the posture of advancing by land and sea. There was another piece of news that worried the king of Hittite the most. A rumor had reached the Hittite capital. It was said that Wuxia had been assassinated on the front lines, and Goliath was plotting to support Prince Ashur to succeed the throne, and would return to the capital with the momentum of a great victory. Unfortunately, Wuxia was being held hostage by and could not publicly refute the rumor in front of the army. It was also temporarily impossible for him to return to the capital to stabilize the situation. Prince Anes was also arranging a countermeasure, and the political situation of Hittite was full of variables. Both sides had their own difficulties, and there was no way to delay it any longer. After going back and forth 7 or 8 times, Madanzo finally decided to negotiate. Igut proposed a condition for the Nra legion to bring supplies and rendezvous with Pharaoh's army, and the Hittite army was not to obstruct them along the way. Goliath agreed, and at the same time ordered the army of Nanner to advance eastwards to rendezvous with the main army. Thus, a strange march took place between the two countries. The elites of the Nra legion opened the way, and the logistics team was heavily escorted through the desert eastwards. Not far to the north, at the edge of the desert and grasslands, the army of Nanner also advanced side by side, keeping a close eye on each other. The Oracle George had returned, and was walking together with the supply team behind him. However, I was not present, and the one leading the personal guards was General John. The vanguard of the two armies had met several times during the march, and although there was no actual battle, there was no lack of verbal sparring. The leader of the opposing army, Oraben, mocked John and the others for only hiding in the rear and letting their superiors take risks, and resorting to despicable activities such as kidnapping and hostage-taking when the battle was disadvantageous. John replied bluntly, "It's not like we haven't fought before, and we both know who won and who lost. If you are not convinced, let's not rely on reinforcements, and just set up a battle formation in the desert. We are not afraid of you." These were, of course, words spoken in a fit of pique, but if the two armies really fought, the Nra legion was not afraid of the other side at all. The king walked north of the army of Nanner under the heavy escort of guards, and he also had 2 personal bodyguards with him. The king sat in the carriage, and Madanzo stood straight behind him with a dagger in his hand. There were no other guards in the carriage, and the driver was The supreme mage Celia did not ride in the carriage, but followed on horseback. She advised Lord Head, why do you have to be the driver yourself? Replied with a smile, I have seen with my own eyes the first warrior of the continent, Enkidu, drive for Gilgamesh. Why can't I drive for His Majesty the King today? I am the one who kidnapped the king, and I am also the one who proposed the peace talks. Of course, it is my responsibility to personally send the king to the venue of the negotiations. Celia reminded him, Don't forget the agreement between us. Are you talking about a duel? Aren't you being too impatient? I still have to command my army to retreat to Igut. When everything is settled, I will send a messenger to you to set a time and place for the duel. I will not go back on my word. The venue for the peace talks had been prepared. 2 large tents were set up in the desert, 20 feet apart from each other. Tables and seats were placed outside the tents, and everyone negotiated face to face, while the armies retreated far away. As a precaution, the supreme mages on both sides each set up a powerful defensive magic formation in the big tents. The edge of the magic formation was in the middle of the open space. Any movement that broke through this boundary would be met with a powerful attack. On the side of Igut, there were the head of the Legion of Isis, Enk, the chief priest Vord, and the front commander, the Shadow Dragon, the chief priest Ricard, and the front commander of the Horus Legion, the chief priest George, and the front commander, John of the Inare Legion, and the important guards around Pharaoh. There were more than a dozen people in total. Chapter 135. There were also more than a dozen people on Hittite's side. Prince Ashur, Goliath, Juguli, Jambi, Walter, Oraben, Afi, Aruka, and others had also arrived. Except for Prince Ashur and Juguli, they were all supreme mages or warriors. However, the seat in the middle was empty, and there was an empty seat beside it. John, who was dressed in heavy armor, was filled with emotion at this moment. Thinking back to when he was on Mount Horeb, he never imagined that he would be standing here today. Just as he was thinking about this, he suddenly noticed that everyone had turned their heads to look in the same direction. Even Pharaoh could not help but stand up from his seat. There was no one else in the audience who was sitting. A carriage slowly approached from a distant sand dune. In the carriage sat King Wuxia, wearing a golden crown on his head. Madanzo had already sheathed his dagger, and was standing majestically beside the king. The driver was a smiling young man with a plain dagger hanging from his waist. He was wearing the ceremonial robes of the head of the legion, but was not wearing any armor. It was Amon, the legendary hero who had captured King Hittite alive. A beautiful woman with a staff in her hand rode a white horse beside him. The wind blew her cloak open, and her hair fluttered in the sun. Her fair face was very beautiful, but her expression was very serious. It was Celia, the supreme mage who had accompanied the king. Amon stopped the carriage at a distance and personally helped the king down. Madanzo had also completed his mission of guarding. He first bowed to King Hittite, then turned around and walked through the magic array to the side of Igut's tent. After saluting Pharaoh, he walked to the side with his sword in hand and stood beside John, just behind the empty seat. Among everyone present, Madanzo's military rank was the lowest. He didn't even have an official title. He was only the captain of Amon's personal guards, but he was the one who had shown his face the most recently. Amon and Celia escorted Wuxia to the front of the Hittite tent. Everyone bowed to the king. The king nodded and turned to sit in his seat. His aura was very dignified, as if he had finally found his bearings. Amon stopped laughing. With a solemn expression, he placed his hand on the hilt of the saber at his waist and knelt on one knee in front of the king. "Your Majesty, I have come to visit you for the sake of peace between the two countries. Thank you for your protection for so many days. Please forgive my offense and disrespect." Wuxia smiled and waved his hand. "I admire your courage. You are a true warrior. I think the title of the greatest warrior on the continent should be given to you, not Enkidu. It is also your credit that the two countries can sit down for peace talks. Just this alone is enough to forgive any mistakes you have made. Lord Commander, please go back and report." Prime Minister Juguli walked over and handed Amon a silver plate with a cast knife on it. On it were the conditions proposed by the Hittite kingdom for the peace talks. There was an embossed emblem on the upper left corner of the silver plate. It looked like a three-leaf clover in the wind, a towering tree, or a ray of light shooting into the sky. It was the symbol of God Enlil. Amon took the silver plate and walked towards Igut's tent. He passed through the border of the two magic formations and knelt in front of Pharaoh. He raised the silver plate over his head and said, "Your Majesty Pharaoh, the commander of the NRA Legion reports to you. The Hittite kingdom has made a request for peace talks. Please take a look." Pharaoh waved his hand. "Amon, I don't understand this language. Please translate it." Only God knew whether he really didn't understand it or not. Amon knelt there and translated the contents of the silver plate. The oath was usually written on clay tablets, but for such an important occasion, the Hittite kingdom had specially prepared a document cast on a silver plate with the emblem of Enlil on it, indicating that the oath had been taken before the gods. After Amon finished reading, someone took the silver plate. Pharaoh lowered his head and smiled. "Commander of the Legion of Amon, my respected supreme warrior, I have long heard of your name and noble and selfless character. Today is the first time I have seen you in person. I didn't expect you to be so young. This time you have led the NRA Legion and made an unprecedented contribution. When you return to Igut, you can ask for whatever reward you want. Sit down first, my warrior." Amon came to the empty seat and sat down. His mission had finally been completed. He didn't say a word during the whole process of the peace talks. He seemed to be quite low-key. The following time belonged to Pharaoh and the king. Goliath, Juguli, Jambi, Ricard, Vord, and Vladislav also participated in the discussion. A real peace treaty would naturally not have only 3 conditions. To Amon's surprise, Pharaoh and the king became more and more relaxed as they talked. In the end, the atmosphere was quite lively. Finally, 2 gold plates were taken out. Goliath and Ricard cast a spell to engrave the first clearly written peace treaty in the history of the Heaven's Pivot. Each gold plate was engraved with cursive script and blade script. The front was written in hieroglyphs and the back was written in secular language. In addition to the emblem of Enril, there was also a relief of an eagle on the upper left of the cursive script. That was the emblem of Horus. The general content of the peace treaty was as follows. 1. The two countries shall coexist peacefully and do not invade each other. No one shall send troops to attack the other city-state. 2. When attacked by a third party, the two countries shall provide each other with help to the best of their ability to resist the common enemy. 3. The Saya Desert and the plains of Duk are buffer zones. Explorers of both countries can enter and pay taxes to their respective city-states and countries when attacked by a third party. 4. The two countries promise to return each other's fugitives to their original owners. The main content of the peace treaty was the above 4 conditions. Of the 3 conditions originally proposed by Hittite, only the first was officially written down. As for the other 2, breaking away from the status of a vassal state and dismantling the Temple of Horus in the territory, the official text of the peace treaty was not written down, because there was no need to write it down. As long as the peace treaty was signed, Hittite's status as a vassal state was self-evident. As for whether or not to dismantle the Temple of Horus after returning, it was entirely their own business. There was no need to write it down on the gold plate and anger the gods. The peace treaty also mentioned that the two countries would work together to resist foreign enemies, which was obviously aimed at Assyria and Babylon. If these two countries attacked and fought for the thousands of miles of fertile land, Hittite would have a hard time, so it was better to get a symbolic helper to avoid being besieged on 3 sides in the future. That fertile land now had an official name, the Plains of Duk. From the content of the peace treaty, explorers from both countries could enter the Plains of Duk, either to open up the wilderness, mine for gold, or hunt monsters, but they had to pay taxes to their respective countries. The Empire of Igut had obtained the right to enter the Plains of Duk, but in reality, it did not mean much, because from Igut's mainland to the Plains of Duk, one needed to cross thousands of miles of the Saya Desert. And if people from both sides could enter freely, the Plains of Duk would naturally still be controlled by the Hittite kingdom. As for the last clause, returning the fugitives to their original owners, it was proposed by Pharaoh. Originally, they were discussing the return of prisoners of war. In normal wars, prisoners of war would become slaves of the other side, and since it was a peace treaty, of course, the prisoners of war had to be released. And the laws of both countries had clauses that prohibited hiding fugitive slaves, so Pharaoh proposed to make an extension in the peace treaty. So such a clause was added. Ammon frowned slightly when he heard this last clause, but did not say anything, because all the lords present had unanimously agreed, and no one had asked Ammon for his opinion alone. The 2 supreme mages completed the casting on the golden plate on the spot, and each side kept a copy, both to be brought back to the shrine as a symbol of eternal preservation. This war with countless deaths and injuries actually ushered in a happy ending. Lazith II and King Lucier became more and more agreeable as they chatted, and perhaps in order to consolidate the alliance between the two countries, he made another request on the spot, to marry the daughter of the King Lucier. What the hell was this? Ammon frowned again, and looked at Celia opposite him with a somewhat displeased expression. She was a noble of the royal family, and the daughter of the king was Celia's cousin. Yet Pharaoh actually made this request. To Ammon's surprise, Lucier was very happy to agree, and agreed on the date of the wedding on the spot. Now Ammon had kidnapped His Majesty Pharaoh's father-in-law a while ago. After the peace talks, a large oval table was put together in the open space between the 2 large tents. People from both sides sat on one side and held a grand banquet, with wine and delicacies all over the table, all of which were rare delicacies in the world. Ammon sat silently in a corner, watching the good show from the climax to the end, trying not to attract attention, but unexpectedly, he still became the focus of everyone's attention. When half of the wine was drunk, the king of Hittite, Lucier, suddenly raised his glass and said, "I propose a toast to the greatest warrior of the continent, Ammon. Without his heroic deeds, there would not be such a happy and peaceful scene today. Ammon, the armies and people of both countries should thank you." The king had no choice but to accept the toast. Ammon stood up, drank up his glass, and said humbly, "I'm just a small commander of a legion, and this is the first time I've led an army. I don't deserve the title of the greatest warrior of the continent." The chief mage of the Legion of Ammon also stood up, raised his glass and said, "Commander of the Legion of Ammon, don't be modest. Since the king has said so, then in the eyes of the people and civilians of Hittite, you are the greatest warrior of the continent. Enkidu is called the greatest warrior of the continent, but he is just a man of courage. When has he ever achieved such achievements as you?" Ammon had to continue drinking, and explained, "I'm just a 7th-level warrior. How can I be compared with Enkidu, who has slain a god? Please don't praise me to death." The Prime Minister of Hittite, Juguli, also stood up, holding his glass and said, "Modesty is a virtue, and so is honesty. Your modesty cannot hide our honesty. This is the evaluation we should give you. You are already a supreme warrior at such a young age, and your first time leading an army, you can train a miscellaneous army into an elite one. Your future is limitless. In time, you will be invincible. This is the most admirable thing. After seeing your bravery, I even wonder if there is anything in this world that you dare not do. Don't you think so, Your Majesty Pharaoh?" The king's toast seemed to be a signal. The ministers under him took turns to stand up and toast Ammon. Their words were more and more flattering, and Ammon's back was sweating. He had taken the king of Hittite hostage, which was a great humiliation to them. It was impossible for these people not to hate him. Of course, these words were said with bad intentions on such an occasion, but no one could refute them. They were all smiling and toasting. This group of people in high positions were naturally experts when it came to scheming and scheming. Ammon was a legion commander under Pharaoh. Of course, his victory also belonged to Pharaoh. But Pharaoh's army was defeated, and only he won, and he even captured the king of Hittite alive. These people only praised Ammon in front of Pharaoh and the other legion commanders. This was putting him on a fire to roast. Looking at Ricard, Enk, and the rest, they all looked very awkward. When Pharaoh heard the question, he smiled and raised his cup. "I am very pleased that there is such a brave general in the empire. And I also believe that everyone here is as loyal and brave as Ammon. Cheers to Ammon, cheers to God." Everyone on Igut's side raised their cups to Ammon. Ammon bit the bullet and raised his cup as well. Glory to the great Pharaoh, to the supreme guidance of God. At the same time, a thought flashed through his mind. The glory of guidance belongs to a cat. After the banquet, both sides returned to their camps and withdrew according to the agreement. Pharaoh's army received the military supplies sent by the Anare Legion. They crossed the desert in a grandiose manner and ordered the Anare Legion to cover their retreat. The peace treaty was signed, and both sides declared that this was their victory. Poems would be inscribed on the stone pillars of the shrines to praise the achievements of the gods and the king. As the side of Hittite, it was natural to declare a great victory, because they got rid of their status as vassals and repelled Pharaoh's army, forcing the other side to sign a peace treaty of non-aggression, and become an offensive and defensive alliance as equals. When the shrines of Horus were demolished everywhere, the glory of the king and the gods reached its zenith. Lazarus too also declared this his victory. He launched an army expedition, captured the other side's king alive, forced Hittite to be the first to propose peace talks and sign an alliance agreement, turning a potential enemy for decades into an ally, and symbolically gaining benefits in the plains of Duk. This war also made the reputation of two other people, Goliath and Ammon. The Hittite army was commanded by Goliath, and it was he who led the army and people to defeat the powerful empire of Igut. It was also he who personally negotiated the rescue of the kidnapped king, and achieved all his goals. Goliath's prestige in Saya was already at its peak, and now he was warmly praised throughout Hittite. After the withdrawal, Goliath resigned from his temporary position as head of the legion, and no longer commanded the army, and the position of commander-in-chief ceased to exist with the end of the war. The king gave him the heaviest reward, and intended to give him the highest glory. He wanted to appoint Goliath as the chief high priest of the main shrine of Enlil, that is, the chief high priest of the entire Hittite kingdom. There were 3 ninth-level supreme mages in the Hittite kingdom, namely Goliath, Jambia, and the former chief high priest of the main shrine of Enlil, Jonah. This time, the king wanted to appoint Goliath to replace Jonah. Whether he was willing or not, there was no higher reward. In this war, Goliath had more or less overshadowed the king. The prime minister of the Hittite kingdom, Juguli, was a supporter of Goliath. The reason was simple, because his nephew Raphael was Goliath's favorite student. This relationship made Juguli think that Goliath and himself should be a political ally, and appointing him as the chief high priest of the kingdom was also the prime minister's suggestion. Unexpectedly, Goliath himself refused and still asked to stay in Saya as a chief priest. If it had been someone else, this would have been seen as unappreciative. How could the king's appointment be refused? But with Goliath's status and prestige, he had enough capital to refuse the king's good intentions and put forward his own request. The king agreed and gave Saya another generous reward, exempted it from taxes for 3 years, and appointed Goliath as the chief elder of the Academy of Hittite. This was a symbolic position of glory, the status of which was equivalent to that of the chief high priest of the kingdom, but it did not hold any real power. With Goliath's status, he could already act according to his will, but the young commander Amon did not have this capital. This battle made Amon's prestige like the sun at high noon. But the situation was also quite delicate. His qualifications were too shallow, and the credit was too great. If he shone too brightly, it would more or less make the defeated generals lose face. It was not known whether Amon's prestige in the legion surpassed that of the gods, but when his soldiers answered the question of which legion they came from, they all proudly answered, Legion of Amon, without mentioning the name of the god, Anare. In the folk, people also habitually called the Anare Legion the Legion of Amon. These were all stories to be told later. At this moment, Amon, who was leading the army to retreat across the desert, had only one thing in mind. Pharaoh had promised in public that after returning to Igut, he could ask for whatever reward he wanted. Amon only wanted Pharaoh to release the people of Duk, and he would guide them back to their hometown. Link's tribe was almost ready for the preliminary work, and after Moses and the others returned, they could immediately build a home, and there was already a good place to stand in the center of the plains of Duk. The merits he had made were enough for Pharaoh to agree to such a request. Maria had hinted and helped him on how to achieve his wish, and Amon had done it. The retreat was smooth and uneventful, and the morale of the Anare Legion was high. In the distance, their armor was bright, and compared to when they had just left Igut, it was as if they had been reborn. Looking at the commander of the front line, John, he looked like a majestic supreme general of the empire riding on a horse. But strangely, Madanzo, who had always liked to show off, seemed very silent, in a trance and thoughtful manner along the way, and hardly talked or laughed. Amon had a similar experience, but Madanzo broke through this state of mind through another way and finally became a supreme warrior and a supreme mage. When he had just crossed this threshold, he really needed to experience the unprecedented feeling, as if he had entered a whole new world. Amon was also a 7th-level supreme mage and warrior, and now that his successor, Madanzo, had achieved the same achievements, Amon did not feel the slightest bit jealous, but very happy. At a time like this, he urgently needed masters by his side. Chapter 136. However, the governor was not punished for this. Instead, he was rewarded by Pharaoh. He deserved the reward because the main responsibility for the defeat of the Legion of Set was Pharaoh himself. Pharaoh claimed victory in the war, so he naturally had to praise the generals under his command. On the other hand, Roddick returned to Sardinia at the fastest speed possible and gathered the remaining soldiers in the southern desert. Not only did he minimize the losses, but he also quickly organized reinforcements and ensured the stability of the rear in the Cape States. Roddick also played a big part in the smooth sailing of the Anare Legion's logistics fleet. When the army returned to the border of Igut, Roddick led the reorganized Legion of Set to the border to provide support. At the same time, he brought enough supplies for Pharaoh to reward the soldiers. This arrangement satisfied everyone. After suffering in the desert for so many days, Pharaoh entered the palace prepared by Sardinia to recuperate for a few days. After summarizing the war, he returned to the capital. The legions were also distributed here and returned to their original stations. Roddick welcomed all the legions at the border until the NRA legion returned safely. When he saw Amon again, the governor was filled with emotion. He grabbed Amon's hand and said, "Brave supreme warrior, great commander, I don't know how to express my admiration for you. When you came to the Cape States to return Nero's relics in public, I never dreamed that you would make such great achievements today. There were many things in the past that I have done to you out of selfishness." Amon interrupted him. "My lord, why do you say that? When I was a foreign hunter of unknown origin, you treated me with courtesy and protection. You also notarized Lord Nero's will and allowed me to obtain such a precious relic. You did not owe me anything. You have never wronged me. It was because you went to Duk that I became who I am today. I am very grateful to you." The two of them walked hand in hand into the borders of Igut. Amon could now walk side by side with Roddick. This was unimaginable a few years ago. When Roderick first arrived in Duk, his status was so high that it was almost unattainable, and he could only look up to him. Amon had never looked up to him, but he had never looked down on him either, whether it was in the past or now. They were supposed to be the last batch to enter the Cape States. The city-state had already prepared a grand ceremony to celebrate their victory, but the ceremony was suddenly postponed. The NRA Legion that had just retreated from the battlefield received an urgent order to become the vanguard to defend against the Uruk Legion that suddenly pounced on Igut. Gilgamesh and Enkidu actually launched an attack on the Cape States. Gilgamesh's timing was very critical. The Igut army had just returned from a long campaign, and its main force had suffered heavy casualties and was exhausted. They did not have time to rest and reorganize. More importantly, apart from the NRA Legion, the Horus Legion and the Legion of Isis, which had suffered defeat in the desert and had been besieged for a long time, had lost their drive and would not be able to fight a tough battle in the short term. After all, legions were made up of people, and there was always a limit to their stamina and energy. After months of tossing and turning in the desert, they were always in a state of high tension. Once they returned to Igut, they naturally relaxed and would not be able to concentrate in a short period of time. The two legions that had arrived in the Cape States earlier had already been repatriated in batches. Only the elite guards and high-ranking generals were left behind. The rest of the soldiers were already on their way back to their encampments. The sudden arrival of the Uruk Legion caught the people off guard. Fortunately, because Amon's kidnapping of the king facilitated the peace talks between the two countries, the Pharaoh army had already withdrawn. Otherwise, the Uruk Legion would have attacked when the Pharaoh army was besieged in the northern part of the desert. Gilgamesh could have taken advantage of the situation, The half of the Legion of Set that Drick had gathered would not have been able to withstand the Uruk Legion. The peace talks between the two countries were an accident that Gilgamesh did not expect. When he sent out his troops, he sent a messenger to write a letter to the commander of the Hittite army, Goliath. The letter strongly condemned the invasion of the pharaohs of Igut by Lazith II, and expressed that the kingdom of Babylon and Uruk were willing to help the Hittite army defeat the cruel enemy. He would send troops to attack the Cape States, cut off the Igut expeditionary army's retreat, occupy their logistics base, and cooperate with the Hittite kingdom to annihilate the Pharaoh army in the desert. If the war really developed in this way, the Igut expeditionary army, including the NRA Legion, would all be doomed. The NRA Legion, the Horus Legion, the Isis Legion, and the Legion of Set would all face the fate of being completely annihilated. Even if the other legions of the Igut army came to their rescue, they would not make it in time. At most, they would have to fight the Uruk Legion after the front line was defeated. Unfortunately, the situation changed too quickly. The moment Gilgamesh's messenger set off, the Igut army and Hittite army had already withdrawn from the peace talks. By the time the Uruk Legion entered the southern part of the Saya Desert, the Pharaoh army had already led the main force back to the Cape States. Gilgamesh's plan to launch a surprise attack failed, but he did not change his marching plan. He continued to lead his army to the border. When Goliath received Gilgamesh's letter on the way back, he could only smile bitterly and let out a long sigh. At that time, Goliath had already relinquished his position as the commander of the army and was no longer in charge of the army. Gilgamesh's letter came too late. Goliath could only pass the letter to King. Hittite army and Igut army had already signed a peace treaty to form an alliance, and the Pharaoh army had already retreated to Igut's territory. Of course, Wuxia would not cooperate with the Kingdom of Babylon. On the other hand, the Kingdom of Babylon might not be doing this out of good intentions. At the same time that the Uruk Legion crossed the Euphrates River and advanced westward, the Kish Legion, the elite Marduk Legion from the Kingdom of Babylon, had already assembled at another crossing on the middle reaches of the Euphrates River, where Enkidu had killed Humbaba. The elite Marduk Legion from the Kingdom of Babylon was also ready to set off. That was the closest point to the Duk Plains. As long as they crossed the Euphrates River and marched along the edge of the mountains, they would reach the eastern shore of the inland lake 300 miles away. The reason for the two legions to assemble there was obvious. They wanted to take advantage of the fact that Hittite army and Igut army were both heavily injured to intervene in the battle for the Duk Plains. Their words were very pleasant to the ears. They wanted to help the Hittite kingdom defend against a powerful enemy. Naturally, they couldn't do it for free. After the battle, they requested the Hittite kingdom to express their gratitude, and the target was naturally the Duk Plains. Wuxia ordered the prime minister to write a letter in reply, politely rejecting Gilgamesh's good intentions. He stated that Hittite and Igut had signed a peace treaty and formed an alliance to defend against foreign enemies together. There was no need for the Kingdom of Babylon or Gilgamesh to worry about it. At the same time, Wuxia sent someone to the Cape States by flying shuttle to deliver an urgent report, informing Pharaoh of the military developments of the Kingdom of Babylon. Of course, Hittite wouldn't send troops across the desert to stop the Uruk Legion. The powerful legion led by Gilgamesh and Enkidu was feared by everyone on the continent. However, Wuxia was also very good with words. In the letter, he mentioned that the two legions of the Kingdom of Babylon had assembled in the city of Kish. He also expressed the need to heavily guard the northern part of the desert and coordinate with Igut in the southern part of the desert. In reality, he meant that they should each take care of their own affairs. The Uruk Legion marched too quickly, and because of the outbreak of war, there were no merchant caravans in the desert. The news along the way was very tightly blocked. Pharaoh only learned of Gilgamesh's movements the day before he received Wuxia's urgent report. Of course he was shocked. Fortunately, the generals were all around him, and after a night of discussion, several urgent orders were issued. The Legion of Isis and the Horus Legion, which were being sent back to their bases in batches, gathered urgently. The wounded and sick returned to their bases to recuperate according to the original plan, and the rest of the soldiers were reorganized. The Geb Legion, which had rushed to the Cape States as reinforcements, was also preparing to return. At this moment, they hurried to the front lines. All these arrangements would take some time, and the most important thing now was to stop the Uruk Legion's first wave of attack. Under the suggestions of the ministers around him, Pharaoh ordered the Nra Legion, which was on the way back, to defend the border and face the enemy. He also appointed Amon as the overall commander of the battlefield. Roddik, who stayed at the border, became the battlefield's quartermaster. Amon was promoted from a legion commander to the overall commander of the battlefield. Not only did he command the Nra Legion, but he also commanded the remnants of the Legion of Set under Roddik's command. After the Legion of Isis and the Horus Legion reorganized and headed to the front lines, they would also be under Amon's command. Excluding the non-combat logistical personnel, the Nra Legion had yet to replenish its troops after returning from the war, and currently had more than 4,000 soldiers that could participate in the battle. The Legion of Set only had more than 2,000 soldiers that could participate in the battle. The Legion of Isis and the Horus Legion had more than 5,000 soldiers that could participate in the battle. Amon would command more than 13,000 soldiers and hundreds of priests. In the Cape States, there were more than 100,000 logistical personnel, as well as civilians who were transporting supplies and building fortifications. This was almost equivalent to Goliath's position in the previous war. Amon was caught off guard, and was pushed to the heart of the struggle. Was Amon so highly regarded by Pharaoh and the ministers of Igut? In reality, this was not the case. This was a job that would only result in mistakes and no merits. It was a position that could even lead to death. It would be the same no matter who took it. Although Amon had been promoted, he would be the unlucky one who had to take the blame because he would definitely be defeated in the battle at the front lines. Uruk was the most powerful city-state in the Kingdom of Babylon apart from the capital, and the Uruk Legion was recognized as the most powerful legion on the continent. In the past few years, Gilgamesh had been secretly recruiting soldiers to train and expand his army. This time, with the main force of the Northern Kingdom covering and restraining them, he had no worries. Therefore, he attacked with all his strength. There were a total of 8,000 well-trained elite soldiers, and nearly 100 priests. Even if Amon commanded the entire army to fight, he would not be able to win. Moreover, the Horus Legion and the Legion of Isis had not finished reorganizing, and were heading to the front lines. With the current Anare Legion and the remnants of the Legion of Set, it was even more impossible for him to stop them. Legend had it that the greatest warrior on the continent, Enkidu, had the bravery of 10,000 men, and could take the head of the commander of an army of 10,000. Whether the legend was true or not, there was no doubt that Enkidu had killed Humbaba. It was better for Amon to think about his own life. Before this, there was a very thought-provoking episode. When Pharaoh arrived at his palace in the Cape States, Amon was still leading the Anare Legion back. Pharaoh summoned his ministers for a discussion, and issued an order for Amon to resign from his position as the commander of the legion, and return to the capital of Igut with him. There would be more important appointments and generous rewards. This decision could not be said to be unreasonable. The Anare Legion was a newly formed miscellaneous army. It was Amon who had single-handedly built this elite division, and achieved a glorious victory in the war. He had also made incredible contributions, and his prestige in the army was like the sun at high noon. If Amon remained as the commander of the legion and disobeyed orders, no one, including Pharaoh, would be able to command the legion. After all, Amon was a foreigner, and his foundation was still shallow. It was impossible for him not to be suspected. As for the reason why everyone was suspicious of him, it was needless to say. Therefore, Pharaoh and the ministers believed that Amon should be given a higher position and more wealth, but he was no longer suitable to be in charge of the legion. Just as the envoy sent by Pharaoh left for the border to pass on the order, news of the Uruk Legion's invasion arrived. Things took a dramatic turn. In an emergency meeting held in the palace, the ministers who had originally suggested that Pharaoh remove the legion of Amon from the position of commander changed their attitude. They unanimously recommended that Pharaoh immediately withdraw the order, and promote Amon to be the commander-in-chief of the battlefield. And so Amon was promoted. This suggestion could not be said to be wrong. Through the recent war, it was proven that Amon was indeed good at fighting. Moreover, his reputation was rising. Appointing him to the position of commander-in-chief was also expected. Pharaoh urgently sent a supreme mage to control the shuttle to catch up with the envoy who had already left halfway. He withdrew the original order, and replaced it with a new one. As the Anare Legion was carrying out a mission to cover the rear, Amon, as the commander of the legion, was at the rear of the army. The vanguard of the Anare Legion had already reached the border between Cape and the main city. Amon did not receive the first order from Pharaoh, but John met the envoy on the way. John was furious when he heard the news. He drew his sword and almost wanted to cut the envoy. No one knew better than John how much effort Amon had put into building the Anare Legion. He had just returned victorious when he was stripped of his military power. The envoy did not dare to provoke the general, so he could only explain with a smile that Pharaoh's intention was to promote Amon to a higher and more important position. John shouted angrily, "Bullshit! Amon is a warrior. Is there a more suitable position than the commander of the legion? Even if he is to be appointed to another position, he can still be the commander of the legion. Such a young supreme general can't be the minister of military affairs of the empire, can he? Do you want a supreme warrior to be the high priest?" When John was angry, he spoke without thinking, and there was a murderous army around him. The envoy was so scared that he did not dare to say more. He could only explain that he was just here to deliver the letter, and that this was the decision of Pharaoh and the ministers. Just then Julian arrived with the latest order in the shuttle. Amon was not only still the commander of the NRA Legion, but also the commander-in-chief of the battlefield. John breathed a sigh of relief. Following this order, he immediately led the vanguard back to the border to meet Amon. On the way back, Amon received the latest order from Pharaoh. The messenger was Julian, who had a grudge against him. Julian was also the chief priest of the Legion of Set, and would stay at the front line under the command of Amon. Amon did not know what the Supreme Mage was feeling at the moment. From a selfish point of view, would he be waiting to see Amon be defeated? But on the battlefield, if the front line was defeated, Julian, as the chief priest of the Legion of Set, would not have a good ending. Seeing the Supreme Mage who had sent people to hunt him down for thousands of miles in the past, Amon did not say any nonsense, nor did he mention a word of the past at all. First, he gave a few words of comfort, and then with a solemn expression, he gathered the generals around him to discuss the battle plan. Now the troops that could be assembled at the border were the majority of the NRA Legion, and the remnants of the Legion of Set. In addition to the important generals of the two legions, there was also an advisor, Aristotle, Roddick's aide. Amon heard that Aristotle was in the army and specially invited him to attend the meeting. But Aristotle used the excuse that he was not proficient in military affairs, and did not speak during the meeting. The generals took out maps and sand tables and studied them for a long time, and all agreed that there was no way to stop the attack of the Uruk Legion. George sighed and said, based on the current situation, even if the Horus Legion and the Legion of Isis regroup and rush to the border, it will be difficult for us to face the Uruk Legion head-on. John asked impatiently, aren't those two legions known as the most elite forces of the Empire? George wanted to say something, but hesitated. That depends on who the opponent is and the current situation. If it was the Horus Legion and the Legion of Isis who had just set off from the border of Igut a few months ago, of course they would not be afraid to fight the Uruk Legion. But now, Julian frowned and said, if we want to be evenly matched, we must wait for the reinforcements of the Geb Legion to arrive at the front line. But distant water cannot put out a nearby fire. The Uruk Legion's marching speed is too fast. I am just a little puzzled. What is the purpose of their battle? In the end, they will not be able to defeat the Empire of Igut, so why bother to attack from afar? Amon pointed at the sand table and said, the purpose of the Uruk Legion's battle can be guessed. They are crossing the desert from east to west, but they do not expect to defeat the entire Empire of Igut. They only want to occupy the territory in the eastern part of the Cape States with water and farmland, build a strategic fortress, and control the entire Saya Desert. Don't forget that apart from the Empire of Igut, Babylon is the strongest of the neighboring countries. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.